There are moments in history when a single act changes everything. A choice made in darkness that echoes through millennia. A kiss that wasn't a greeting but a betrayal. And at the center of it all stands one man, clutching 30 pieces of silver in trembling hands, his name forever synonymous with treachery. Judas Iscariot, the apostle who betrayed Jesus Christ with a kiss. But here's the question that has haunted theologians, historians, and believers for 2,000 years. Was Judas the greatest villain in human history? A man who freely chose evil and sealed his own damnation? Or was he an instrument of divine necessity, playing out a role that had to be fulfilled for humanity's salvation? Could the crucifixion have happened without him? And if it couldn't, then what does that say about his guilt, his choice, his fate? Before we open today's scroll, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It helps us keep these in-depth stories of faith, history, and mystery alive. And as always, let us know where in the world you're watching from. This channel has become a global fellowship of seekers, historians, believers, and thinkers united by curiosity. Now take a deep breath and step with me into the pages of time. Picture yourself in an upper room in Jerusalem. The year is approximately 33 in the Common Era. Oil lamps flicker against stone walls, casting dancing shadows across the faces of 13 men gathered around a low table. The air is thick with the scent of unleavened bread and wine. Outside, the city swells with Passover pilgrims. Hundreds of thousands of Jews from across the known world come to celebrate their liberation from ancient Egypt. But inside this room, something else is happening. Something that will reshape human history. Jesus of Nazareth, the rabbi from Galilee who has spent 3 years gathering followers and challenging religious authorities, reclines at the table with his 12 closest disciples. They've shared countless meals together. They've walked dusty roads from village to village. They've seen him heal the sick, give sight to the blind, even raise the dead. These 12 men have given up everything to follow him, believing he is the promised Messiah who will restore Israel's glory. But tonight the atmosphere feels different, heavy, charged with an unspoken dread. Jesus takes bread, breaks it, and speaks words that confuse them. "This is my body given for you." He lifts a cup of wine and says, "This is my blood poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." The disciples exchange troubled glances. What does he mean? Why does he speak of his body and blood as if he's about to die? Then Jesus says something that shatters the intimacy of the moment like a stone through glass. "Truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me." Silence falls like a shroud. 12 pairs of eyes widen in shock. 12 hearts begin to race. The word betray hangs in the air, ugly and impossible. Betray? One of them. One of the 12 who have been chosen, who have witnessed miracles, who have heard the secrets of the kingdom. "Surely not I, Lord," they begin to ask one after another, their voices layered with genuine confusion and hurt. Peter, always the boldest, looks stricken. John, the beloved disciple, leans closer to Jesus. Thomas, Matthew, James, they all protest their innocence, their loyalty. But one voice among them knows the truth. Judas Iscariot, the man who keeps the common purse, who has walked beside Jesus for 3 years, who has been trusted with their finances, sits frozen. His mind races. Does Jesus know? How could he know? The arrangement with the chief priests was made in secret in shadowed corridors away from prying eyes. 30 pieces of silver they promised him. The price of a slave. The price of betrayal. According to the gospel accounts, Jesus dips a piece of bread and hands it to Judas, a gesture that in that culture could signify honor or identification. "What you are about to do, do quickly," Jesus tells him. Not a command exactly, not quite permission. Something stranger, an acknowledgement, a release. Judas takes the morsel, and in that moment the Gospel of John tells us Satan entered into him. He rises from the table. The other disciples assume he's going to buy something for the feast or perhaps to give something to the poor, since he holds the money bag. They don't suspect. They don't imagine. How could they? Judas is one of them, a chosen apostle, a trusted companion. But Judas walks out of that upper room and into the night, and John's gospel adds a detail that chills the blood, and it was night. Not just the literal night of Jerusalem's dark streets, but the night of the soul, the night of human history's darkest hour, the night when all the light of the world would be for a terrible moment extinguished. Now fast forward several hours. The scene shifts to a garden called Gethsemane, an olive grove on the Mount of Olives where Jesus often goes to pray. He's brought Peter, James, and John with him deeper into the garden, asking them to keep watch while he prays. But they keep falling asleep, exhausted by the heavy meal and the late hour, unable to grasp the gravity of what's coming. Jesus prays with such anguish that, according to Luke's account, his sweat becomes like drops of blood falling to the ground. "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." He knows what's coming. He's known all along, and still in his humanity he feels the full weight of it, the torture, the humiliation, the separation from God as he takes on the sins of the world. Then through the olive trees comes the sound of approaching footsteps, many footsteps, the clink of metal, the glow of torches cutting through the darkness. Judas arrives leading a crowd, a mob really, armed with swords and clubs, temple guards sent by the chief priests and elders. Perhaps some Roman soldiers as well, though the Gospels aren't entirely clear on this point. What is clear is that they've come in force, as if to arrest a dangerous criminal, even though Jesus has been teaching openly in the temple courts for days. They could have taken him at any time. But they want to do this quietly, away from the crowds who might riot if they seize the popular teacher in broad daylight. And they need someone to identify him, someone who knows him intimately, someone who can pick him out in the dark among his disciples. They need Judas. "Greetings, Rabbi," Judas says, approaching Jesus, and then he does it, the act that will define him for all eternity. He kisses Jesus, the customary greeting between a disciple and his teacher, the sign of affection and respect, transformed in this moment into the ultimate act of betrayal. A kiss, not a curse, not violence, not even words of accusation, just a kiss. The intimacy of it makes the betrayal all the more devastating. He doesn't even have the honesty of open enmity. He wraps his treachery in a gesture of love. "Friend," Jesus responds, using a word that could also be translated as companion or even comrade. Not an angry denunciation, not a curse, just this simple, devastating word. "Friend, do what you came to do." Then the chaos erupts. The guards seize Jesus. Peter, finally awake and understanding what's happening, draws a sword and strikes the high priest's servant, cutting off his ear. Jesus heals the man's ear with a touch and rebukes Peter. "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" And in that moment, watching it all unfold exactly as Jesus said it would, the disciples understand this isn't a mistake. This isn't a surprise attack that caught Jesus off guard. This is something else. Something planned. Something that Jesus is allowing to happen. They panic. They run. All of them scatter into the night, leaving Jesus alone with his captors. All except John, who will follow at a distance to the high priest's house, and Peter, who will also follow, only to deny 3 times that he even knows Jesus before the rooster crows at dawn. But what about Judas? Where does he go after the kiss? The Gospels don't tell us immediately. He fades from the narrative, disappearing into the darkness from which he emerged. We'll hear of him again, but not until later, when the weight of what he's done comes crushing down upon him. For now, we're left with questions. Terrible, necessary questions. Why did Judas do it? Was it simply greed, 30 pieces of silver? That seems too simple, too small a motivation for such an enormous act. Was it disillusionment? Had he expected Jesus to be a different kind of Messiah, a political liberator who would overthrow Rome? And when Jesus refused that role, did Judas decide to force his hand? Some scholars suggest this, that perhaps Judas thought betraying Jesus to the authorities would force him to reveal his power to finally become the conquering king that many Jews expected. Or was it something darker? The Gospels tell us that Satan entered into Judas. Was he possessed? Was he a puppet? And if so, how much can we hold him responsible? And here's the most troubling question of all. If Jesus had to die for humanity's sins to be forgiven, if the crucifixion was part of God's plan from the beginning, then didn't someone have to betray him? Didn't Judas play a necessary role? And if he did, can we really call him evil? Or was he, in some twisted way, the second most important figure in Christian salvation history? The dark mirror to Jesus' light, the one who made redemption possible? These questions have no easy answers. They've troubled believers and skeptics alike for 2 millennia. They touch on the deepest mysteries of free will and predestination, of human nature and divine purpose, of sin and redemption. To understand Judas, we need to go back before the betrayal, back before the Last Supper, back to the beginning, to the world he was born into. The forces that shaped him, the choices that led him to that garden with a kiss of death on his lips. We need to understand not just what Judas did, but who he was. And to do that, we must step into the tumultuous, expectant, dangerous world of first-century Judea. The world Judas Iscariot entered as a young man was nothing like the peaceful, pastoral landscape we often imagine when we think of ancient Judea. This was a land seething with tension, occupied by foreign soldiers, divided by bitter religious and political factions, and gripped by a fever dream of liberation. To understand why Judas made the choice he did, we must first understand the world that made him. Picture Judea in the first decades of the Common Era. The land promised to Abraham, conquered by Joshua, ruled by David and Solomon, destroyed by Babylon, rebuilt under Persian permission, and conquered again by Alexander the Great. Now for nearly a century it had been under Roman control, and Rome's grip was iron. The Romans called it Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But for the Jews living under occupation, there was nothing peaceful about it. Roman soldiers patrolled the streets of Jerusalem. Roman standards bearing the image of the emperor, considered blasphemous idols by Jewish law, had been brought into the holy city. Roman taxes bled the people dry, collected by fellow Jews who collaborated with the occupiers for profit. The position of high priest, once a sacred hereditary office, was now essentially appointed by Rome, given to those who would cooperate with imperial interests. Every day, Jews were reminded that they were subjects, not citizens, that their land was occupied territory, that the God who had promised them this land and deliverance from their enemies seemed to many to have gone silent. But memory ran deep in Judea. These people had not forgotten their history. They remembered the Maccabees who, just over a century and a half earlier, had risen up against the Seleucid Greeks when they tried to suppress Jewish religion and defile the temple. That revolt had succeeded. Against impossible odds, a small band of faithful warriors had driven out the occupiers and reclaimed their independence. The festival of Hanukkah celebrated that victory every year, keeping the flame of resistance alive in Jewish hearts. If God had delivered them once, couldn't he do it again? Wouldn't he do it again? The prophets had spoken of a coming deliverer, a Messiah, an anointed king from the line of David who would restore Israel's glory. The prophet Isaiah had written of a suffering servant who would bear the sins of many. The prophet Daniel had spoken of a son of man coming on the clouds of heaven. The prophet Zechariah had described a king coming to Jerusalem humble and riding on a donkey who would proclaim peace to the nations. These prophecies were studied, debated, interpreted, and reinterpreted in synagogues across the land. And in the first century, the expectation had reached a fever pitch. Surely many believed the time was now. Surely deliverance was at hand. But what kind of deliverance? What kind of Messiah? This is where the factions divided. The Pharisees were perhaps the most influential religious group among the common people. Their name meant the separated ones, and they took the Torah, the law of Moses, with absolute seriousness. But they didn't stop with the written Torah. They believed in an oral Torah as well, traditions passed down through generations that helped apply God's law to everyday life. They believed in resurrection of the dead, in angels and spirits, in a coming judgment. They tried to live lives of ritual purity, keeping themselves separate from anything that might defile them. Many were sincere, deeply devout men. But some, as Jesus would later critique, became so focused on the minutiae of religious law that they lost sight of its spirit, straining out gnats while swallowing camels. For the Pharisees, the solution to Israel's problems was religious faithfulness. If the people would just keep the law properly, if they would just maintain purity and devotion, then God would send deliverance. The Messiah they expected would be a righteous king, yes, but primarily a teacher and spiritual reformer who would lead the nation back to proper observance of the covenant. The Sadducees represented a very different perspective. These were the aristocratic priestly families, the wealthy elite who controlled the temple and its lucrative operations. Unlike the Pharisees, they rejected the oral traditions and accepted only the written Torah. They didn't believe in resurrection or in angels. They were, in many ways, the pragmatists of first-century Judaism. They had worked out an accommodation with Rome, maintaining their power and privilege by cooperating with the occupiers. The high priest Caiaphas, who would later play a crucial role in Jesus' trial, was a Sadducee. For them, the status quo wasn't perfect, but it was tolerable. Revolution would only bring destruction. Better to maintain what power they had than risk losing everything. Then there were the Essenes, though this name comes from later writers and we're not entirely certain what they called themselves. These were the separatists who had given up on mainstream Jewish society altogether. Many scholars believe they were the community responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, those precious manuscripts hidden in caves near Qumran that wouldn't be discovered until 1947. The Essenes saw the temple priesthood as corrupt, defiled, illegitimate. They withdrew to the wilderness to live in strict purity, preparing for the end times. They studied the prophets obsessively, believing they were living in the final days before God would intervene dramatically in human history. They expected not just one Messiah, but two, a priestly Messiah and a kingly Messiah. They practiced ritual washings, held property in common, and maintained strict discipline. Some were celibate, seeing marriage as a distraction from their holy calling. And then there were the zealots. These were the revolutionaries, the resistance fighters, the ones who believed that God helps those who help themselves. They looked back to the Maccabees and asked, why not again? They refused to pay taxes to Rome, considering it blasphemy to give to Caesar what belonged to God. They carried daggers under their cloaks, and some of them, called Sicarii, or dagger men, would slip through crowds at festivals and assassinate Roman collaborators or officials before melting back into the masses. They believed the Messiah would be a military leader, a new David who would rally the faithful and drive out the Romans by force. They were willing to die for this cause, and many did. Rome crucified thousands of Jewish rebels in the first century. lining the roads with crosses as warnings to others who might resist. Into this volatile mix of hope, anger, competing visions, and desperate longing came wandering preachers and self-proclaimed prophets. Some claimed to be the Messiah, others claimed to be Elijah returned, the prophet who was supposed to come before the great and terrible day of the Lord. A man named Judas persuaded hundreds to follow him to the Jordan River, promising he would part the waters like Moses. Roman soldiers slaughtered his followers and brought his severed head to Jerusalem. An Egyptian Jew convinced thousands that at his command, the walls of Jerusalem would fall down like Jericho, allowing them to overthrow the Roman garrison. That movement also ended in bloodshed. The Roman governors who ruled Judea from Caesarea on the coast varied in their skill and temperament. Some tried to understand the people they governed. Others held them in contempt. Pontius Pilate, who governed from 26 to 36 in the Common Era, was particularly tone-deaf to Jewish sensibilities. He brought military standards bearing the emperor's image into Jerusalem by night, causing an uproar. He seized temple funds to build an aqueduct which sparked protests that he violently suppressed. He was, by most accounts, a man who ruled through intimidation and cared little for the religious scruples of his subjects. This was the powder keg Judas grew up in. Every Passover, when Jews commemorated their liberation from slavery in Egypt, the Roman governor would come up from Caesarea to Jerusalem with extra troops anticipating trouble. The crowds would swell to enormous numbers, and in those crowds revolutionary fervor would bubble and occasionally boil over. The execution of dissidents was routine. Crosses dotted the landscape around Jerusalem and along major roads. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who resist Rome. Yet resistance continued. The memory of independence, brief though it had been under the Maccabees, refused to die. The prophecies of deliverance were read and reread. Every sign in the heavens, every unusual event was scrutinized for meaning. Was this the time? Was this the beginning of God's intervention? And then from the wilderness came a wild man dressed in camel hair, eating locusts and wild honey, standing waist-deep in the Jordan River and preaching repentance. John the Baptist, as he would be called, drew enormous crowds. He spoke with the authority of the old prophets, calling the people back to righteousness, warning of coming judgment, preparing the way for someone greater who would come after him. Even the Pharisees and Sadducees came out to investigate this phenomenon. John called them a brood of vipers and warned them not to presume on their heritage as Abraham's children. God could raise up children for Abraham from stones, he thundered. What mattered was repentance, turning back to God with genuine hearts. And then one day a carpenter from Nazareth, a small and somewhat disreputable village in Galilee, came to be baptized by John. And John declared that this was the one he had been preparing the way for. The Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. The one whose sandals John wasn't worthy to untie. Jesus of Nazareth began his ministry in this atmosphere of expectation and tension. He traveled through Galilee and Judea, teaching in synagogues, healing the sick, casting out demons, and gathering followers. His message was both familiar and strange. He spoke of the kingdom of God, a phrase that would have resonated with messianic expectation. But this kingdom, he said, wasn't coming with observable signs. It was already among them. It was like a mustard seed, tiny at first, but growing into something vast. It was like yeast working through dough. It belonged to the poor, the meek, the persecuted. He taught with authority, not like the scribes who always quoted previous teachers and traditions. He said, "You have heard it said, but I say to you," placing his own interpretation above. Traditional readings, he touched lepers who were supposed to be untouchable. He ate with tax collectors and sinners who were supposed to be shunned. He healed on the Sabbath, violating the Pharisees' strict interpretations of rest day observance. He spoke of God as Father in an intimately personal way that struck some as beautiful and others as blasphemous. And he gathered 12 disciples, specifically 12, a number resonant with the 12 tribes of Israel. The symbolism was clear. This was about the restoration of Israel. Among those 12 was a man from Iscariot, a village in the south. His name was Judas, son of Simon, and when Jesus chose him as one of the 12, Judas must have felt the full weight of that calling. To be among the inner circle of a potential Messiah in a time when messianic expectation was at its height meant everything. But what kind of Messiah did Judas expect Jesus to be? What were his hopes, his dreams, his understanding of what following this rabbi from Nazareth would mean? The Gospels don't tell us directly. We have to piece it together from fragments, from his later actions, from the culture he came from. And as we'll see, the clash between what Judas hoped for and what Jesus actually was may hold the key to understanding the darkest betrayal in history. To understand the man who would commit history's most infamous betrayal, we must first grapple with a frustrating truth. We know remarkably little about Judas Iscariot's early life. The Gospels tell us almost nothing about where he came from, who his family was, or what his life looked like before he encountered Jesus. We are left to work with fragments, hints, linguistic clues, and the dangerous territory of educated speculation. Yet even these fragments paint a picture worth examining, for they may help us understand not just what Judas did, but why. Let us start with his name, Judas. In Hebrew, Yehuda, the same name as one of the 12 sons of Jacob, the ancestor of the tribe of Judah from which King David himself descended. It was a noble name, a patriotic name, one that connected its bearer to the very heart of Jewish identity. Judah the tribe had produced Israel's greatest king. The name meant praise or thanksgiving. In first-century Judea, it was not an uncommon name. In fact, among Jesus' own followers, there were 2 men named Judas. This Judas, who would betray Jesus, and another disciple often called Judas, son of James or Thaddeus, to distinguish him from the betrayer. But it's the second part of his name that intrigues historians and theologians. Iscariot. This word has puzzled scholars for centuries, and its exact meaning remains debated to this day. The most common interpretation is that it means man of Iscariot or from Iscariot, identifying Judas by his hometown in a way similar to how Jesus was called Jesus of Nazareth, or how we might identify someone today as John from Boston or Maria from Madrid. If this interpretation is correct, then Judas came from a town called Iscariot, most likely Iscariot Hezron in southern Judea, about 23 miles south of Hebron. This detail, if true, carries significant weight. It would make Judas the only one of the 12 apostles who was not from Galilee. The others, Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, the other James, Simon the Zealot, and the other Judas, all came from the northern region of Galilee, particularly around the Sea of Galilee. They were provincial northerners, looked down upon by the sophisticated Jews of Jerusalem and Judea. Their accents marked them as Galileans. Peter's accent would later give him away when he denied Jesus, a servant girl saying, "Surely you are one of them, for your accent gives you away." But Judas, if he was truly from Iscariot in Judea, would have been different. He would have been from the south, from the heartland, closer to Jerusalem and the temple. Perhaps more educated, more refined, more politically aware than his northern companions. This might explain why Jesus entrusted him with the money bag, the common purse from which the group drew for their needs and gave to the poor. Judas became the treasurer, the financial manager of this wandering band of disciples. It was a position of trust, of responsibility, suggesting that Jesus saw in him someone capable and reliable. Yet there is another possible meaning of Iscariot that we cannot ignore, one that carries darker implications. Some scholars suggest the name might derive from the Latin word sicarius, which means dagger man or assassin. The Sicarii were a faction within the Zealot movement, extremists who carried short daggers called sicae hidden in their clothing. They would move through crowded markets or festivals, sidle up next to Roman officials or Jewish collaborators, stab them quickly, and disappear into the crowd before anyone realized what had happened. They were urban guerrillas, terrorists by any modern definition, religious zealots who believed that assassinating the enemies of God was holy work. Could Iscariot mean that Judas was or had been one of these dagger men? It's not impossible. The theory is controversial and not accepted by all scholars, but it's worth considering. If Judas had zealot connections or sympathies, it would radically affect how we understand his motivations. Perhaps he saw in Jesus not just a spiritual teacher, but a potential revolutionary leader, someone who could spark the uprising that would finally drive Rome out of the Holy Land. What we do know from the Gospels is that Judas's father was named Simon. The Gospel of John specifically identifies him as Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. And in some ancient manuscripts, Simon also carries the Iscariot designation, suggesting it was a family name or origin marker, not something unique to Judas. This tells us that whatever Iscariot meant, it likely identified the family, not just the man. Beyond this, the Gospels are silent about Judas's background. We don't know if he was married, though most Jewish men of that age were. We don't know if he had children. We don't know what trade he practiced before following Jesus, whether he was a fisherman like Peter and Andrew, a tax collector like Matthew, or something else entirely. We don't know his age, though he was likely young, as most of the disciples appear to have been. What drew Judas to Jesus? This question haunts any serious examination of his story. Thousands of people followed Jesus during his ministry. Crowds pressed around him wherever he went. But only 12 were chosen as his inner circle, his apostles, the ones who would be with him constantly, learning from him, being prepared to carry his message after he was gone. Jesus spent a whole night in prayer before choosing these 12, according to Luke's Gospel. The selection was deliberate, prayerful, significant. So why Judas? If Jesus could see into people's hearts, if he knew the future, why would he choose someone who would betray him? This theological puzzle will occupy us later, but for now, let us ask a more basic question. What did Judas see in Jesus that made him want to follow? Perhaps Judas, like so many others, was captivated by Jesus' teaching. No one had ever spoken like this man. His parables were simple yet profound, his insights into human nature devastating, his vision of God's kingdom compelling. He spoke of a God who was not distant and angry, but intimately present, a father who noticed when a sparrow fell, who counted the hairs on each person's head. He painted pictures of a kingdom where the last would be first, where the poor were blessed, where the pure in heart would see God. Or perhaps what drew Judas was the miracles. Jesus healed people unquestionably. Even his enemies didn't deny this. They simply attributed his power to demons rather than to God. He gave sight to the blind, made the lame walk, cleansed lepers, cast out evil spirits. Once he fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Another time he calmed a storm with a word. And there were whispers that he had even raised the dead, a girl in Capernaum, a widow's son in Nain. If you witnessed such things, wouldn't you want to follow such a man? Wouldn't you believe he might be the one the prophets had foretold? But perhaps, and this is where the zealot theory gains traction, what drew Judas was something more political. Perhaps he saw in Jesus the potential liberator of Israel. After all, the crowd certainly did. When Jesus entered Jerusalem for that final Passover, they waved palm branches, a symbol of Jewish nationalism dating back to the Maccabean revolt. They shouted,, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, blessed is the King of Israel." They were proclaiming him king, the Messiah, the one who would restore David's throne. Jesus had power. He commanded authority. He spoke with conviction. He wasn't afraid of the Pharisees or the Sadducees. He challenged their interpretations, called out their hypocrisy. When he cleansed the temple, overturning the tables of the money changers and driving out those who were selling animals for sacrifice, it was an act of prophetic confrontation. Some saw it as the action of a reformer, but others might have seen it as the opening move of a revolution. If Judas came from a zealot background or sympathized with their cause, he might have joined Jesus' movement, expecting it to become something more militant. He might have believed that Jesus' talk of the kingdom of God was coded language for the restoration of Israel's political independence. That the time would come when Jesus would reveal his true purpose, raise an army of the faithful and march on Jerusalem to claim the throne of David. There's some evidence in the Gospels that other disciples may have shared similar expectations. James and John, whom Jesus nicknamed Sons of Thunder, once asked if they could sit at his right and left hand in his kingdom. Their mother approached Jesus, asking him to grant her sons the chief positions of authority when he came into his power. The disciples argued among themselves about who would be greatest in the kingdom. Even after the resurrection, just before Jesus' ascension, the disciples asked him, "Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel?" They were still thinking politically, still imagining an earthly kingdom, still hoping for national liberation. Perhaps Judas thought the same way. Perhaps he joined Jesus' movement expecting a revolution, and gradually, over 3 years, realized he had misunderstood, that Jesus had no intention of raising an army or overthrowing Rome. That when Jesus spoke of his kingdom not being of this world, he meant it literally. That the kingdom of God Jesus preached was something internal, spiritual, subversive in a completely different way than armed rebellion. How disillusioning that must have been, if true. To give up everything, to follow this charismatic leader, to be chosen as one of the 12, to believe you were part of something world-changing, only to gradually understand that your leader had no interest in the kind of change you'd envisioned. To watch Jesus refuse the crown when the crowds wanted to make him king by force. To hear him say things like, "Love your enemies and turn the other cheek and render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's." To see him associate with tax collectors who collected money for Rome, with Roman centurions even commending their faith. We must be careful not to paint Judas as purely mercenary or purely political. The truth is likely more complex. Human motivation usually is. Perhaps Judas was drawn by multiple factors: genuine spiritual hunger, messianic hope, political expectations, personal ambition, the desire to be part of something significant. Perhaps he truly loved Jesus, was truly transformed by his teaching, and yet still harbored expectations that would ultimately be disappointed. What we can say with certainty is that at some point something changed. The man who had left everything to follow Jesus, who had been entrusted with the group's finances, who had witnessed countless miracles and heard countless teachings, began to turn. The seeds of betrayal were planted. Whether through disillusionment, greed, demonic influence, or some combination we cannot fully understand, Judas began the journey toward that garden, toward that kiss, toward infamy. But before that dark end, there were 3 years of walking with Jesus. 3 years of being one of the 12. 3 years that must have held moments of genuine fellowship, learning, wonder, and hope. We must now examine those years, for somewhere in them lies the key to understanding how an apostle became a betrayer. The moment of calling is everything in Jewish tradition. When God called Abraham, he left his homeland and became the father of nations. When God called Moses from the burning bush, a slave became the liberator of his people. When God called Samuel in the night, a boy became a prophet. The call was not just an invitation, it was a transformation, a setting apart, a claiming for divine purpose. And when Jesus called Judas Iscariot to be one of his 12 apostles, that call carried the weight of centuries of sacred history. The Gospel of Luke tells us that before choosing the 12, Jesus went up on a mountainside and spent the entire night in prayer. Imagine that scene. Jesus alone on the mountain, perhaps looking down at the crowds of followers camped below, praying through the darkness, seeking his Father's will about this crucial decision. By morning, he had made his choice. He called his disciples to him, and from the larger group, he selected 12. 12. The number was not accidental. Nothing about Jesus was accidental. 12 represented the 12 tribes of Israel, the children of Jacob who became a nation. But those tribes had been scattered, lost to history, when Assyria and Babylon had conquered and exiled them centuries earlier. Only Judah and remnants of Benjamin remained as recognizable entities. Yet here was Jesus, choosing 12, signaling something profound. This was about restoration, about the renewal of Israel, about gathering God's people back together under a new covenant. To be chosen as one of these 12 was to be given an extraordinary honor and responsibility. Think about the context. By this point in his ministry, Jesus had become famous throughout Galilee and Judea. Everywhere he went, crowds pressed in on him. Thousands came to hear him teach, to be healed, to witness the miracles. Many wanted to follow him, to become his disciples, to learn from this remarkable rabbi who spoke with such authority and demonstrated such power. But from these thousands, Jesus chose only 12 for this intimate inner circle. 12 who would eat with him daily. 12 who would travel with him constantly. 12 who would receive private explanations of the parables he told in public. 12 who would be trained, shaped, prepared to carry forward his mission after he was gone. The list of names appears in all 3 synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, with slight variations but fundamental agreement. First always came Simon, whom Jesus renamed Peter, meaning rock. Then came Peter's brother Andrew. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, the ones Jesus called Boanerges, sons of thunder. Philip from Bethsaida. Bartholomew, also called Nathanael. Matthew, the former tax collector. Thomas, who would later be called Doubting Thomas. James, the son of Alphaeus, sometimes called James the Less to distinguish him from the other James. Simon the Zealot, identified by his political affiliation or perhaps his zealous temperament. Judas, son of James, also called Thaddeus. And finally, last in every list, Judas Iscariot. Even in the Gospels, written decades after the events, after everyone knew what Judas had done, his name appears in these lists. He was one of the 12. This cannot be erased or ignored. Whatever darkness came later, there was a beginning when Jesus looked at Judas and said, "Follow me," and Judas responded. What did that moment feel like? We can only imagine. Perhaps Jesus found him in a synagogue, listening to the Torah being read. Perhaps he encountered him among the crowds that followed from town to town. Perhaps Judas had been there from the early days, one of John the Baptist's disciples who transferred his allegiance to Jesus as some of the others had done. The Gospels don't tell us. But at some point Jesus called him and Judas said yes. He said yes to leaving behind whatever life he had known. Yes to becoming a wanderer dependent on the hospitality of others, without home or security. Yes to being associated with a controversial teacher who was already making enemies among the religious establishment. Yes to something he may not have fully understood but believed was worth everything. And Jesus entrusted him with the money bag. This detail is significant. In that traveling band of disciples, someone needed to manage the finances. They received donations from supporters. Wealthy women who believed in Jesus' mission, like Joanna, the wife of Chuza, who managed Herod's household, and Susanna and Mary Magdalene, provided for the group out of their own resources. When Jesus sent the 12 out on missionary journeys, they would return with whatever people had given them. There were practical needs: food, lodging when hospitality wasn't offered freely, perhaps tools or supplies, alms for the poor they encountered. Judas became the keeper of this common purse. It wasn't a glamorous role, but it was essential, and it required trust. You don't give someone control of the group's money unless you believe they're honest and capable. Some have suggested that Judas was chosen for this role because he had education or experience with finances. Perhaps. Or perhaps Jesus simply saw something in him, a capacity for organization, a practical skill that complemented the more impulsive personalities of some of the other disciples. The Gospel of John, written latest of the 4 canonical Gospels and with the harshest portrayal of Judas, claims that Judas was a thief who used to help himself from the money bag. But we must be careful with this. John wrote his Gospel decades after the events in a community that had processed and theologized what happened. His Judas is painted in the darkest colors from the beginning, almost demonized. The other Gospels don't mention this stealing. If Judas had been obviously dishonest from the start, would the other disciples have tolerated him remaining as treasurer? Would Jesus have kept him in that position? It's more likely that if Judas did take money improperly, it happened gradually, perhaps starting as small justifications, the kind of moral erosion that begins in tiny compromises and grows into something larger. Or perhaps John's claim reflects the community's later understanding, looking back and reinterpreting everything through the lens of the betrayal. What we know for certain is that for some period of time, months or even years, Judas functioned as one of the 12 without apparent incident. He witnessed the miracles. He heard the Sermon on the Mount, if Matthew's placement is historical, with its radical teachings about loving enemies and turning the other cheek. He was there when Jesus calmed the storm on the Sea of Galilee, when the disciples cried out in fear and Jesus rebuked the wind and waves. He saw Jesus heal the paralyzed man who was lowered through a roof by his friends. He watched Jesus touch lepers, those untouchable outcasts, and make them clean. At some point, Jesus sent the 12 out on a mission. The Gospel accounts tell us he gave them authority to drive out demons and to heal diseases. He sent them out 2 by 2 to the towns and villages of Israel, instructing them to travel light, to accept hospitality where it was offered, to shake the dust off their feet where it was refused. And they went, these 12, including Judas, and they preached repentance, cast out demons, and healed the sick. Judas did this. He participated in the miraculous. He wielded the authority Jesus gave him. He returned, like the others, amazed at what had happened. "Lord, even the demons submit to us in your name," they reported with joy. How do we reconcile this with what came later? How does someone go from casting out demons in Jesus' name to betraying him for silver? The question haunts us because it suggests that proximity to holiness, even participation in divine work, doesn't automatically transform the heart. That it's possible to be close to Jesus, to be chosen by him, to witness wonders and still remain unchanged at the deepest level. Or perhaps to begin changing, but then to turn back, to resist, to choose differently. In Jewish tradition, discipleship meant total commitment. A disciple didn't just learn information from a rabbi. He learned a way of life. He imitated his teacher in everything, seeking to become like him. The goal was transformation, not just education. When someone became a disciple, they were binding themselves to their rabbi, submitting to his authority, trusting his guidance. This makes the betrayal even more shocking. In that culture, the bond between rabbi and disciple was sacred. To betray your teacher was to violate one of the most fundamental relationships in society. It would be like a son betraying his father, a crime against the natural order. Yet for a time, Judas walked faithfully in that bond. He was part of the community. He shared meals with Jesus and the others. He experienced the joy of those early days when the crowds were enthusiastic, when miracles happened regularly, when it seemed like something truly extraordinary was unfolding. He must have had conversations with Peter about Jesus' identity. He must have laughed with John at something Thomas said. He must have sat around evening fires exhausted from walking all day, listening to Jesus explain the mysteries of the kingdom. These were real moments, real relationships, real experiences. Judas's story is not simply about a villain who was evil from the start. It's more troubling than that. It's about someone who was chosen, who responded to that choosing, who walked in fellowship with the Son of God, and yet somewhere along the way something went wrong. The light he had been walking toward began to feel like darkness, or perhaps the darkness within him grew stronger than the light around him. But those turning points still lay ahead. For now, in these early days, Judas was simply one of the 12, walking the dusty roads of Galilee and Judea, part of a movement that would change the world, carrying the money bag and the trust of his rabbi, not yet knowing that his name would become synonymous with betrayal, that a kiss would define him for all eternity. The road from Galilee to Jerusalem is approximately 70 miles, a journey of several days on foot through varied terrain. But the road Judas walked with Jesus over 3 years covered far more than geographical distance. It was a journey through the landscape of human hope and divine mystery, through miracles that defied nature and teachings that overturned conventional wisdom. To understand how that journey ended in betrayal, we must first understand what Judas witnessed along the way. Imagine walking with Jesus through the villages of Galilee. You rise early before the sun has fully broken over the hills. Jesus is already awake, having slipped away to pray, as is his habit. When he returns, you break bread together, simple fare, and then set out. Within an hour of entering the next town, a crowd has gathered. They always gather. Word travels ahead of you now, the man who heals, the teacher who speaks with authority, the one some are calling the Messiah. A woman pushes through the crowd, desperate. She has been bleeding for 12 years, spent everything on physicians who couldn't help her. According to the law, her condition makes her ritually unclean. Anyone she touches becomes unclean. But she believes if she can just touch the hem of Jesus' garment, she'll be healed. She reaches out, her fingers brush the tassels of his prayer shawl, and instantly she knows. The bleeding stops. Jesus stops too, turns, asks who touched him. The disciples, including Judas, think this is absurd. Everyone is touching you, Rabbi, they say. The crowd is pressing in from all sides. But Jesus insists someone touched him in a different way, with faith. The woman comes forward trembling and confesses. And Jesus speaks words of healing, of peace, of wholeness. Judas witnessed scenes like this not once, but countless times. He saw blind men receive sight, their eyes suddenly registering light and color for the first time. He saw lame men leap up from mats they'd been carried on. He saw demons shrieking as they fled from people they'd tormented for years. He was there when Jesus raised Jairus' daughter from death, when he called into the tomb, "Little girl, get up!" And she sat up, alive again. How does witnessing such things shape a person? For most, you would think it would create unshakable faith. Yet somehow, for Judas, it wasn't enough. Or perhaps it was too much. Perhaps the miracles raised expectations that Jesus would then disappoint in other ways. The teachings were equally extraordinary. Judas heard the parables, those deceptively simple stories that carried profound meanings. He heard about kingdoms and seeds, about lost coins and prodigal sons, about workers in vineyards and talents buried in the ground. He heard Jesus explain that the kingdom of God was like a mustard seed, the smallest of seeds that grows into the largest of garden plants. Or like yeast that a woman mixes into flour until it works through the whole batch of dough. But he also heard teachings that must have troubled him. "Blessed are the poor in spirit," Jesus said. "Blessed are those who mourn, who are meek, who hunger and thirst for righteousness." This was backwards. The blessed were supposed to be the powerful, the wealthy, the successful. Yet Jesus kept turning expectations upside down. The last will be first. The greatest must be the servant of all. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. These teachings were revolutionary, but not in the way a zealot would hope. They offered no plan for military resistance, no strategy for overthrowing Rome. Instead, they spoke of an internal kingdom, a transformation of the heart, a way of being in the world that transcended political categories. One moment stands out in the Gospels where Judas is specifically named, and it reveals something crucial about his character, or at least his concerns. It happened in Bethany, a small village less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, just days before Passover, before that final journey to the cross. Jesus was dining at the home of Simon the leper, a man he had presumably healed. As they reclined at the table, a woman entered carrying an alabaster jar. Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, whom Jesus had raised from the dead weeks earlier. She broke open the jar and poured the contents over Jesus' head and feet. It was pure nard, an expensive perfume imported from distant lands. The fragrance filled the house, sweet and overwhelming. And then she did something even more shocking. She let down her hair, a gesture of intimacy that would have scandalized many, and used her hair to wipe Jesus' feet. It was an act of extravagant devotion, of worship, of love that surpassed social conventions. But not everyone was moved. "Why this waste?" someone objected. The Gospel of John specifically identifies this voice as belonging to Judas Iscariot. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages, 300 denarii, nearly a year's income for a common laborer, poured out in a single moment. From a purely economic standpoint, Judas had a point. 300 denarii could feed many hungry people. It could provide for widows and orphans. It could do tangible good in a world full of suffering. Jesus' response was sharp. "Leave her alone. She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them any time you want. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial." Burial. Jesus was speaking again about his death, something he had been doing with increasing frequency lately. But the disciples, including Judas, didn't seem to grasp it, or didn't want to grasp it. Messiahs weren't supposed to die, they were supposed to reign. John's Gospel adds a damning editorial comment about this moment. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. But even if we set aside John's interpretation, written decades later with full knowledge of what Judas would do, the moment is revealing. Judas saw waste where Jesus saw worship. He calculated cost where Jesus recognized love. He thought in terms of economics and practical utility where Jesus recognized an act of prophetic symbolism. Mary was anointing him for burial, recognizing at some level that the path Jesus walked led to death. This moment at Bethany might represent a breaking point. Some scholars suggest this was when Judas made his decision, when something inside him finally snapped. If Jesus wasn't going to be the Messiah Judas hoped for, if he was going to allow such waste, if he was going to speak constantly about dying instead of conquering, then perhaps it was time to force the issue. Or perhaps it was time to cut losses and salvage something from the wreckage of disappointed hopes. Over 3 years, Judas had seen enough miracles to convince anyone of Jesus' power. He had heard enough teaching to understand Jesus' vision of the kingdom. He had been given authority, sent out to preach and heal, included in the most intimate circle of followers. He had witnessed the transfiguration of expectations, the transformation of conventional understanding, the revelation of a God who was both more glorious and more disturbing than anyone had imagined. But somehow, it wasn't enough. Or perhaps it was precisely because of what he had witnessed that Judas felt betrayed himself. He had signed up for something that turned out to be different from what he expected. And now, as they made their way toward Jerusalem for what would be their final Passover together, something dark was crystallizing in Judas's heart. A plan was forming. A terrible, irreversible choice was approaching. The road from Galilee to Jerusalem is approximately 70 miles, a journey of several days on foot through varied terrain. But the road Judas walked with Jesus over 3 years covered far more than geographical distance. It was a journey through the landscape of human hope and divine mystery, through miracles that defied nature and teachings that overturned conventional wisdom. To understand how that journey ended in betrayal, we must first understand what Judas witnessed along the way. Imagine walking with Jesus through the villages of Galilee. You rise early before the sun has fully broken over the hills. Jesus is already awake, having slipped away to pray, as is his habit. When he returns, you break bread together, simple fare, and then set out. Within an hour of entering the next town, a crowd has gathered. They always gather. Word travels ahead of you now. The man who heals. The teacher who speaks with authority. The one some are calling the Messiah. A woman pushes through the crowd, desperate. She has been bleeding for 12 years, spent everything on physicians who couldn't help her. According to the law, her condition makes her ritually unclean. Anyone she touches becomes unclean. But she believes if she can just touch the hem of Jesus' garment, she'll be healed. She reaches out, her fingers brush the tassels of his prayer shawl, and instantly she knows. The bleeding stops. Jesus stops too, turns, asks who touched him. The disciples, including Judas, think this is absurd. Everyone is touching you, Rabbi, they say. The crowd is pressing in from all sides, but Jesus insists someone touched him in a different way, with faith. The woman comes forward, trembling, and confesses, and Jesus speaks words of healing, of peace, of wholeness. Judas witnessed scenes like this not once but countless times. He saw blind men receive sight, their eyes suddenly registering light and color for the first time. He saw lame men leap up from mats they'd been carried on. He saw demons shrieking as they fled from people they'd tormented for years. He was there when Jesus raised Jairus' daughter from death, when he called into the tomb, "Little girl, get up." And she sat up, alive again. How does witnessing such things shape a person? For most, you would think it would create unshakable faith. Yet somehow for Judas it wasn't enough. Or perhaps it was too much. Perhaps the miracles raised expectations that Jesus would then disappoint in other ways. The teachings were equally extraordinary. Judas heard the parables, those deceptively simple stories that carried profound meanings. He heard about kingdoms and seeds, about lost coins and prodigal sons, about workers in vineyards and talents buried in the ground. He heard Jesus explain that the kingdom of God was like a mustard seed, the smallest of seeds that grows into the largest of garden plants, or like yeast that a woman mixes into flour until it works through the whole batch of dough. But he also heard teachings that must have troubled him. "Blessed are the poor in spirit," Jesus said. "Blessed are those who mourn, who are meek, who hunger and thirst for righteousness." This was backwards. The blessed were supposed to be the powerful, the wealthy, the successful. Yet Jesus kept turning expectations upside down. The last will be first. The greatest must be the servant of all. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. These teachings were revolutionary, but not in the way a zealot would hope. They offered no plan for military resistance, no strategy for overthrowing Rome. Instead, they spoke of an internal kingdom, a transformation of the heart, a way of being in the world that transcended political categories. One moment stands out in the Gospels where Judas is specifically named, and it reveals something crucial about his character, or at least his concerns. It happened in Bethany, a small village less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, just days before Passover, before that final journey to the cross. Jesus was dining at the home of Simon the leper, a man he had presumably healed. As they reclined at the table, a woman entered carrying an alabaster jar. Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, whom Jesus had raised from the dead weeks earlier. She broke open the jar and poured the contents over Jesus' head and feet. It was pure nard, an expensive perfume imported from distant lands. The fragrance filled the house, sweet and overwhelming. And then she did something even more shocking. She let down her hair, a gesture of intimacy that would have scandalized many, and used her hair to wipe Jesus' feet. It was an act of extravagant devotion, of worship, of love that surpassed social conventions. But not everyone was moved. Why this waste? Someone objected. The Gospel of John specifically identifies this voice as belonging to Judas Iscariot. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. 300 denarii, nearly a year's income for a common laborer, poured out in a single moment. From a purely economic standpoint, Judas had a point. 300 denarii could feed many hungry people. It could provide for widows and orphans. It could do tangible good in a world full of suffering. Jesus' response was sharp. "Leave her alone. She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them any time you want. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial." Burial. Jesus was speaking again about his death, something he had been doing with increasing frequency lately. But the disciples, including Judas, didn't seem to grasp it, or didn't want to grasp it. Messiahs weren't supposed to die. They were supposed to reign. John's Gospel adds a damning editorial comment about this moment. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. But even if we set aside John's interpretation written decades later with full knowledge of what Judas would do, the moment is revealing. Judas saw waste where Jesus saw worship. He calculated cost where Jesus recognized love. He thought in terms of economics and practical utility where Jesus recognized an act of prophetic symbolism. Mary was anointing him for burial, recognizing at some level that the path Jesus walked led to death. This moment at Bethany might represent a breaking point. Some scholars suggest this was when Judas made his decision, when something inside him finally snapped. If Jesus wasn't going to be the Messiah Judas hoped for, if he was going to allow such waste, if he was going to speak constantly about dying instead of conquering, then perhaps it was time to force the issue. Or perhaps it was time to cut losses and salvage something from the wreckage of disappointed hopes. Over 3 years, Judas had seen enough miracles to convince anyone of Jesus' power. He had heard enough teaching to understand Jesus' vision of the kingdom. He had been given authority, sent out to preach and heal, included in the most intimate circle of followers. He had witnessed the transfiguration of expectations, the transformation of conventional understanding, the revelation of a God who was both more glorious and more disturbing than anyone had imagined. But somehow, it wasn't enough. Or perhaps it was precisely because of what he had witnessed that Judas felt betrayed himself. He had signed up for something that turned out to be different from what he expected. And now, as they made their way toward Jerusalem for what would be their final Passover together, something dark was crystallizing in Judas's heart. A plan was forming. A terrible, irreversible choice was approaching. The upper room was borrowed space, secured through arrangements made by Peter and John earlier that day. A large room on the second floor of a house in Jerusalem, furnished with cushions and low tables in the traditional manner. The city below teemed with Passover pilgrims, perhaps 300,000 people crammed into streets built for far fewer. Every available room had been claimed, which made this private space for 13 men something of a miracle in itself, or perhaps evidence of a secret sympathizer among Jerusalem's residents who was willing to risk association with the controversial rabbi from Galilee. As evening descended and lamps were lit, the 13 gathered. The mood should have been celebratory. Passover was the feast of liberation, commemorating the night God's angel passed over the Hebrew homes in Egypt while striking down the firstborn of their oppressors. It was about deliverance, about the birth of a nation, about God's faithfulness to his covenant people. Jewish families across the city were gathering for the same ritual meal, asking the traditional 4 questions. Retelling the story of Exodus, eating the symbolic foods that connected them to their ancestors' suffering and salvation. But something was different in this upper room. Jesus had been speaking about his death for weeks now, cryptic statements that troubled the disciples. The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and he must be killed and on the 3rd day be raised to life. They didn't understand, or they understood the words but couldn't accept their meaning. Peter had even rebuked Jesus for such talk, earning the sharpest response Jesus ever gave him. "Get behind me, Satan." Now in this room the tension was palpable. Jesus moved through the Passover liturgy, but he was adding elements, changing things, infusing the ancient ritual with new meaning. He took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and said words that must have shocked them. "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Then he took the cup of wine, part of the traditional 4 cups drunk during the Passover meal, and said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." Body given, blood poured out, new covenant. The disciples must have looked at each other in confusion and growing dread. What was he saying? Why was he speaking this way? And then Jesus said something that shattered whatever remained of the evening's peace. "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." Silence. Complete, devastating silence. Then an eruption of voices, overlapping, desperate, confused. "Surely not I, Lord?" they began asking one after another. The Greek text suggests they asked this repeatedly, each man needing reassurance, needing to hear Jesus say it wasn't him. Think about the psychology of that moment. These men had left everything to follow Jesus. They had staked their lives, their reputations, their futures on him. They had endured ridicule from family members who thought they were following a false prophet. They had made enemies of powerful people. And now Jesus was saying one of them was a traitor. John, the youngest disciple, the one Jesus particularly loved, was reclining next to Jesus in the place of honor. Peter, unable to contain himself, motioned to John, urging him to ask Jesus who he meant. John leaned back against Jesus' chest, the customary position when reclining at a table, and asked quietly, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus' answer was given through action. "It is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." At a Passover meal, the host would dip pieces of unleavened bread, matzah, into a mixture called charoseh, made of apples, nuts, wine, and spices, representing the mortar the Israelite slaves had used to make bricks in Egypt. To offer someone a dipped piece was an act of friendship, even honor. Jesus dipped the bread, and he gave it to Judas Iscariot. Try to imagine what happened in that moment. Did the room go silent again? Did the other disciples understand the significance of what they had just witnessed? The gospel accounts suggest they didn't, not fully. They were too confused, too overwhelmed by everything that was happening. But Judas knew, and Jesus knew that Judas knew. What you are about to do quickly, Jesus told him. Not a command exactly, not permission, but something stranger. An acknowledgement, a release. Jesus was not stopping him, was not exposing him to the others, was not preventing what was about to unfold. He was allowing Judas to make his choice, to walk the path he had already set his feet upon. The Gospel of John adds a chilling detail. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. Whether this is meant literally, a demonic possession at that exact moment, or whether it's John's theological interpretation of the spiritual darkness that had been growing in Judas, the language is stark. Whatever line had not yet been fully crossed was crossed now. The decision was made. The wheels were in motion. Judas stood up from the table. The other disciples assumed he was going out to buy something for the feast or to give something to the poor, since he held the money bag. It says something about how little they suspected him. Even after Jesus' warning, even after the dipped bread, they didn't put it together. They thought Judas was going on an errand, doing his job as treasurer. But Judas was going to the chief priests. He was going to finalize the arrangements he had already begun. He was going to lead an armed crowd to the place where he knew Jesus would be praying, the Garden of Gethsemane, where they had gone many times before. Before he left, did he look back? Did he meet Jesus' eyes one last time? Did he feel anything? Regret, determination, fear, anger. The Gospels don't tell us, they simply record that he went out. And then John adds those 4 terrible words that carry the weight of both literal and metaphorical truth. And it was night. Night in Jerusalem. Night in the soul of Judas. Night descending on the world as the light of the world prepared to be extinguished, however briefly. Night before the darkest day in human history, when the Son of God would hang on a Roman cross bearing the sins of humanity. After Judas left, Jesus continued teaching the remaining 11. He spoke about love, about abiding in him as branches abide in a vine, about the Holy Spirit who would come after he left them. He prayed for them, a long prayer recorded in John's Gospel, asking his Father to protect them, to sanctify them, to keep them united. He spoke tenderly, knowing these were his final hours with them. But even as he taught and prayed, the clock was ticking. Judas was moving through Jerusalem's dark streets, making his way to the authorities, setting in motion events that could not be stopped. The Passover lamb was about to be slain, and Judas Iscariot was leading the way to the slaughter. The darkness that John described was not merely the absence of daylight. As Judas left the upper room and moved through Jerusalem's narrow streets, he carried darkness with him. But he was not walking into unknown territory. The meeting he was heading toward had already been arranged. The betrayal had begun before that final supper, before the dipped bread, before Jesus' words about one of them being a traitor. The question we must ask is, when did Judas first approach the religious authorities, and what led him to that threshold? The Gospel accounts tell us this happened during the final week of Jesus' life, that tense period after his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. The city was electric with messianic expectation. The crowds had welcomed Jesus like a king, shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David," waving palm branches, spreading their cloaks on the road before him. Then he had gone straight to the temple and overturned the tables of the money changers and those selling sacrificial animals, declaring, "My house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers." This act was not merely religious protest. It was political dynamite. The temple was the economic heart of Jerusalem. The money changers provided a necessary service, exchanging the various currencies pilgrims brought into the Tyrian shekels required for the temple tax. The sellers of doves and lambs enabled pilgrims to fulfill their sacrificial obligations. But the system had become corrupt, controlled by the high priestly families who profited enormously from it. When Jesus disrupted this commerce, he was challenging not just religious hypocrisy but economic power structures. The chief priests and elders took notice. They had been watching Jesus for some time, looking for ways to arrest him. But they faced a problem. Jesus was popular with the common people. To seize him publicly might cause a riot, especially during Passover when nationalistic fervor ran high and Jerusalem swelled with pilgrims. They needed a way to take him quietly away from the crowds. They needed information about his movements, his patterns, where he could be found isolated and vulnerable. They needed someone on the inside. And then, improbably, someone from the inside came to them. Matthew's Gospel records it simply. Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. 30 pieces of silver, the price stops us cold. Not because it was an enormous sum, it wasn't, but because of what it represented. In the book of Exodus, 30 shekels of silver was the price of compensation if an ox gored a slave to death. It was the value of a slave's life. In the prophet Zechariah, God tells the prophet to ask for his wages from the people of Israel, and they pay him 30 pieces of silver. God's response drips with irony, "A princely price at which I was valued by them." The prophet is then told to throw this insulting amount to the potter in the house of the Lord. Whether Judas knew these scriptural echoes or not, whether the chief priests deliberately chose this amount for its symbolic weight or it was simply the standard price for such information, the resonance is inescapable. Jesus, the one who claimed to be the Son of God, was being valued at the price of a slave. The Good Shepherd was being sold for the compensation price of a dead bondservant. But who exactly were these chief priests that Judas approached? To understand this, we must grasp the structure of power in first-century Jerusalem. At the top stood the high priest, during this period a man named Joseph Caiaphas. He had held the position for about 18 years, an unusually long tenure that indicated he was skilled at navigating the treacherous waters of Roman-Jewish relations. His father-in-law, Annas, was the power behind the throne, a former high priest himself who still wielded enormous influence. These men were Sadducees, members of the priestly aristocracy. They controlled the temple and its revenues, which were substantial. Thousands of animals were sacrificed daily during major festivals. The temple tax collected from Jews throughout the diaspora flowed into their coffers. They had made an accommodation with Rome, maintain order, keep the people compliant, and in exchange they could retain their religious authority and economic privileges. But this accommodation came at a cost to their souls, if we can speak of such things. They had become collaborators in the eyes of many Jews. They cared more about preserving their power than about justice or true faithfulness to God's covenant. They were the establishment that the prophets had always warned against. Religious leaders who used their position for personal gain, who neglected justice and mercy while maintaining scrupulous attention to ritual. Jesus threatened all of this, not with an army, but with something more dangerous: moral authority. When he taught, people recognized truth. When he healed, they saw God's power. When he challenged the religious leaders, pointing out their hypocrisy, their greed, their hardness of heart, the crowds listened. And more than that, they agreed. Jesus was undermining the authority of the very people who depended on that authority for their wealth and position. So when Judas came to them offering to deliver Jesus into their hands, they must have felt a surge of relief, perhaps even gratitude. Here was the solution to their problem handed to them by one of Jesus' own inner circle. They could arrest him quietly, away from the crowds, try him quickly, and hand him over to the Romans for execution before anyone knew what was happening. Luke's gospel adds a detail that Matthew and Mark don't include. The chief priests and officers of the temple guard were delighted when Judas made his offer. The Greek word suggests pleasure, even joy. They had been looking for an opportunity, and now one of Jesus' own disciples was providing it. But what about Judas's motivation? Matthew says he asked, "What are you willing to give me?" suggesting financial motivation. John's gospel, as we've noted, claims Judas was a thief who had been helping himself to the money bag all along. But 30 pieces of silver, while not nothing, was hardly a fortune. It might sustain a man for a few months, perhaps a year, if he was frugal. It wasn't retirement money. It wasn't enough to explain abandoning 3 years of investment in following Jesus, throwing away the prestige of being one of the 12, and betraying a man who had trusted him. Perhaps the money was simply the outward transaction for something more complex. Perhaps Judas had convinced himself that Jesus wasn't who he claimed to be, that the movement was going nowhere, that it was time to cut his losses. Perhaps he told himself he was actually doing something noble, forcing Jesus' hand, compelling him to reveal his power and establish his kingdom. Perhaps the 30 pieces of silver was just enough to salve his conscience, to make him feel that at least he was getting something out of the wreckage of his hopes. Or perhaps something darker was at work. The Gospels speak of Satan entering Judas, of demonic influence. Whether we understand this literally or metaphorically, it points to a spiritual dimension beyond simple human psychology. There are moments when evil seems to take on a life of its own, when human weakness and cosmic darkness converge, when someone crosses a line and finds themselves in territory they didn't fully anticipate. The agreement was made. The silver was counted out, probably Tyrian shekels, the standard currency, for such transactions. Judas probably received it in a small leather pouch heavy with the weight of blood money, though neither he nor the priests would have called it that yet. The terms were clear. Judas would lead them to Jesus at a time when he was away from the crowds, and he would identify him with a sign they agreed upon. The meeting in some shadowy chamber of the temple complex ended. Judas slipped back into the night, heading toward the upper room where Jesus and the other disciples were preparing the Passover meal. He carried the money with him, those 30 pieces of silver that would burn through his soul like acid before the week was done. He carried a secret that separated him from the 11 men who still trusted him, who still saw him as their companion, their fellow apostle. And in the temple, the chief priests began making their own preparations. They would need to move quickly once Judas brought them to Jesus. They would need to assemble the Sanhedrin, the council of 70 elders who served as the supreme court of Jewish law. They would need to find witnesses, manufacture charges, create the legal veneer of a trial that would satisfy at least the appearance of justice. And they would need to convince Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, to carry out the execution, since they didn't have the authority to impose the death penalty themselves. The machinery of injustice was beginning to turn, and at its center, enabling it all, was Judas Iscariot, walking through Jerusalem with blood money in his purse and darkness in his heart, heading back to share one final meal with the man he had agreed to betray. The distance from the upper room to the Garden of Gethsemane was less than a mile, but it might as well have been the distance between life and death. After the meal, after Judas had departed into the night, Jesus led the remaining 11 disciples out of the city, across the Kidron Valley, and up the slope of the Mount of Olives to an olive grove he knew well, a place called Gethsemane, which means oil press, where olives were crushed to extract their precious oil. How fitting that Jesus would come here to be crushed, his soul pressed down by the weight of what was coming. It was late, perhaps near midnight. The full Passover moon hung overhead, casting silver light through the gnarled branches of ancient olive trees. Some of these trees may have been centuries old, their trunks twisted and thick, their roots deep in the rocky soil. The garden was quiet except for the sound of wind through leaves and the distant murmur of the city below, where thousands of families were completing their Passover celebrations, unaware that the true Passover lamb was about to be sacrificed. Jesus brought 8 of the disciples to the garden's entrance and told them to sit there while he prayed. But he took Peter, James, and John deeper into the grove. These 3 had witnessed the transfiguration, that mysterious moment on another mountain, when Jesus' appearance had changed, his face shining like the sun, his clothes becoming white as light, and Moses and Elijah appearing to speak with him about his coming departure. If anyone could understand what was happening now, it should be these 3. But what they witnessed in Gethsemane was not glory. It was agony. Jesus, who had walked on water and calmed storms with a word, who had spoken with such authority and certainty, was suddenly overwhelmed with sorrow. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he told them. The Greek word used here suggests a sorrow so profound it could kill, an anguish that crushes the spirit and threatens to extinguish life itself. He withdrew from them about a stone's throw and fell to the ground. The man who had stood before Pilate with such dignity, who would face his accusers with unflinching calm, was now prostrate in the dirt, his face pressed to the earth, crying out to God. Luke's gospel, written by a physician who paid attention to physical details, tells us that his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. Whether this was metaphorical or describes the rare medical condition called hematidrosis, where extreme stress causes blood vessels in the sweat glands to rupture, the image is devastating. "Abba, Father," Jesus prayed, using the intimate Aramaic word a child would use for their daddy. "Everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me." The cup was a metaphor they would have understood. Throughout the Hebrew scriptures, the cup represented God's judgment, his wrath against sin. The prophets spoke of nations drinking from the cup of God's fury. Now Jesus was facing that cup filled to the brim with every sin, every betrayal, every act of violence and hatred and greed that humanity had committed or would commit. He was about to drink it down to the dregs. But even in this moment of raw human fear and anguish, Jesus added the words that would define his entire mission. "Yet not what I will, but what you will." Submission, surrender, not to fate, not to inevitability, but to the Father's purpose. This was not passive resignation. This was active choice made in full knowledge of what it would cost. An angel appeared to strengthen him, Luke tells us. What form that strengthening took, what words were spoken, we are not told. But after this divine encounter, Jesus prayed even more earnestly. The battle was being fought here in this garden in this moment of choice. Would he go through with it? Would he drink the cup? Would he allow what was about to unfold? He rose and returned to the 3 disciples. They were asleep. Peter, who had promised he would die with Jesus rather than disown him. James and John, who had asked to sit at his right and left hand in his kingdom. All 3, overcome by exhaustion and the heavy meal and perhaps the emotional weight of the evening, had fallen asleep. "Simon," Jesus said to Peter, using his old name, "are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour?" There was sadness in the question, not anger. He understood their weakness. "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." 3 times this pattern repeated. Jesus withdrawing to pray in agony. Jesus returning to find them sleeping. Jesus gently rebuking them, understanding their human limitation even while needing their support. It's one of the most poignant details in the gospel accounts, this contrast between Jesus' agony and the disciples' inability to stay awake, between what was happening in the spiritual realm and what was happening in the physical. But on the third return, Jesus' words were different. Are you still sleeping and resting? Enough. The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. Through the olive trees they could see lights approaching, torches and lanterns bobbing in the darkness, the sound of many feet, the clink of metal. A crowd was coming up the path, and at its head walked a figure the disciples recognized: Judas. The other disciples, hearing the commotion, came running from the entrance of the garden. They all stood together now, confused, still half asleep, watching as this armed crowd approached. There were temple guards, servants of the high priest, perhaps some Roman soldiers as well. They carried swords and clubs, came prepared for resistance, as if they were arresting a dangerous criminal rather than a teacher who had spent the week openly teaching in the temple courts. Judas walked ahead of them, and when he was close enough for Jesus to see his face in the torchlight, he called out, "Greetings, Rabbi," and moved forward to embrace him. In Jewish culture, a disciple greeting his rabbi with a kiss on the cheek was customary, a sign of respect and affection. It was how you identified your teacher, how you showed honor. Parents kissed children. Friends kissed friends. Rabbis and disciples exchanged such kisses regularly. But this kiss was different. This kiss was a signal prearranged with the temple guards. In the darkness and confusion, with multiple men standing together, they needed to know which one to arrest. Judas had told them, "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." So Judas kissed Jesus. Not a quick peck, but what Mark's gospel describes with a word that suggests repeated action or intensity. He kissed him warmly, thoroughly, making absolutely certain there could be no mistake about which man was Jesus. The symbolism is almost unbearable. The most intimate gesture of affection transformed into an act of betrayal. Love's expression twisted into hatred's tool. A kiss which should create connection used to enable separation. Everything that is good and pure about human relationship perverted into its opposite. Jesus looked at Judas and said, "Friend, do what you came for." Other accounts record slightly different words. "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" But in all versions there is this quality of deep sadness, of recognition without surprise, of allowing what is happening while naming it for what it is. The crowd surged forward, hands reached for Jesus, and suddenly chaos erupted. Peter, finally awake and understanding what was happening, drew a sword. He swung wildly at the nearest target, the high priest's servant, a man named Malchus. The blade caught Malchus's ear, severing it. Blood flowed. Shouting filled the garden, violence begetting violence. But Jesus stopped it. "No more of this," he commanded. He touched Malchus's ear and healed it, the last miracle recorded before his arrest. Even in this moment, even as he was being betrayed and seized, he was still healing, still showing compassion, still revealing the nature of God's kingdom. "Put your sword back in its place," he told Peter, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels?" A Roman legion numbered about 6,000 soldiers. 12 legions would be 72,000 angels. Jesus was saying that he could summon an army from heaven that would obliterate this crowd, this city, this entire region. But he chose not to. But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way? The key word, must. Not because he was powerless, but because this was the plan. This was the cup he had chosen to drink. This was the path he had set his face toward from the beginning. Then Jesus turned to the crowd. "Am I leading a rebellion, that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour when darkness reigns. Your hour when darkness reigns." The forces of evil working through religious leaders who should have known better, through a disciple who had walked with him for 3 years, through a mob armed and ready for violence, were having their moment. But it was only a moment, only an hour. Darkness always thinks it has won when it extinguishes the light, but darkness never understands resurrection. The guards seized Jesus, they bound his hands, and at that moment the disciples did what terrified people do. They ran, all of them. Peter and John would later follow at a distance, but in that initial moment of panic, they all scattered into the night, leaving Jesus alone with his captors. The shepherd was struck and the sheep fled, just as the prophet Zechariah had foretold centuries before. And Judas? The Gospels are silent about what he did after the kiss. Did he stay to watch the arrest? Did he fade back into the crowd? Did he return with them to the high priest's house to witness the trial? We don't know. He had done what he came to do. The betrayal was complete. The machinery of injustice was in motion, and there was no way to stop it now. The kiss had been given, the arrest made. Jesus was led away through the darkness, bound and surrounded by armed guards, taken first to the house of Annas, the former high priest who still wielded power behind the scenes. And somewhere in that chaotic scene, Judas Iscariot disappeared from the immediate narrative. The Gospels focus their attention on Jesus, on Peter's denials, on the travesty of the trials. But what about Judas? Where did he go? What did he see? What was happening in his mind and heart as the consequences of his betrayal unfolded? The Gospels don't tell us explicitly, but Matthew's account gives us a crucial detail. Judas was present the next morning when he saw that Jesus had been condemned. This suggests he was somewhere nearby during the night, watching, waiting, perhaps unable to tear himself away from the catastrophe he had set in motion. Let us imagine, based on what we know of human nature and the geography of Jerusalem, what those terrible hours might have been like for the man who had just betrayed the Son of God. After the crowd led Jesus away from Gethsemane, Judas likely followed at a distance, just as Peter and John did. Perhaps he stayed farther back, more fearful of being recognized, more aware of what he had done. The procession made its way back across the Kidron Valley, up through the sleeping streets of the lower city, toward the mansions of the priestly aristocracy in the upper city. These were homes of wealth and power, built with stone and decorated with mosaics, standing in stark contrast to the humble dwellings most Jerusalem residents occupied. They brought Jesus first to Annas, Caiaphas's father-in-law. Though no longer officially the high priest, Annas remained the patriarch of the family that controlled the temple establishment. 5 of his sons would eventually serve as high priest. His was the power that needed to be consulted, the authority that needed to be satisfied. The preliminary interrogation happened in his house while runners were sent out to gather members of the Sanhedrin for an emergency session at Caiaphas's residence. Judas, if he was watching, would have stood in the courtyard or perhaps on the street outside, in the shadows where the torchlight didn't quite reach. The night was cold. It was still early spring, the time of year when Jerusalem's elevation made the nights chilly. Inside the courtyard of the high priest's house, according to John's Gospel, Peter had gained entrance and was warming himself by a fire with the servants and guards. But Judas would not have dared enter. He was not known as a disciple in the way Peter was. His face now was the face of betrayal. What did he expect to happen? This is the question that haunts any examination of Judas's actions. Surely he knew that leading the authorities to Jesus would result in arrest. But arrest for what purpose? Did he believe they would simply question Jesus, perhaps intimidate him and then release him? Did he think Jesus would finally reveal his power, call down those legions of angels he had spoken about, and overthrow his captors? Or did Judas, in the darkest possibility, know exactly what would happen and simply not care anymore, blinded by whatever mixture of disillusionment, greed, or demonic influence had taken hold of him? As the night wore on, as messengers came and went, as members of the Sanhedrin arrived at Caiaphas's house, Judas would have begun to realize this was serious. This was not going to end with a warning or a release. The religious authorities were moving with unusual speed, conducting proceedings in the middle of the night, violating their own laws about when capital cases could be heard. According to Jewish law, capital cases were supposed to be tried during daylight hours, were supposed to begin with arguments for acquittal rather than conviction, were supposed to allow a full day to pass before sentencing. None of these safeguards were being observed. Inside, Jesus stood before the hastily assembled council. The high priest and elders had gathered along with teachers of the law, the scribes who were experts in interpreting Torah. They needed to build a case against Jesus, needed to find grounds for a death sentence. But they struggled. Various witnesses came forward with accusations, but their testimonies didn't agree. Under Jewish law, conviction required at least 2 witnesses whose accounts matched in every detail. But the witnesses contradicted each other, their stories falling apart under examination. Some claimed Jesus had said he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. He had said something like this, but they misunderstood his meaning. He had been speaking of the temple of his body, of his death and resurrection. But even these witnesses couldn't get their stories straight about exactly what he had said or when. Finally, Caiaphas, frustrated by the proceedings going nowhere, stood up and confronted Jesus directly. "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. He offered no defense, made no attempt to refute the accusations. His silence must have been unnerving, powerful in its own way, the silence of a man who had already accepted what was coming. Then Caiaphas posed the question that mattered, the one that cut through all the false testimony and legal maneuvering. "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Under oath, by the living God, no Jew could refuse to answer such a charge. And Jesus, who had been silent through all the false accusations, now spoke. "You have said so," he replied, which in that culture was a way of affirming the question. Then he added words that sealed his fate. "But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." He was quoting Daniel, the prophet whose vision spoke of one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven, approaching the Ancient of Days, being given authority and glory and sovereign power. He was claiming divine status, claiming a position at God's right hand, claiming that he, Jesus of Nazareth, was the fulfillment of messianic prophecy. Caiaphas tore his robes, the traditional sign of having heard blasphemy. "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He is worthy of death," they answered. Death. The word would have carried out through the courtyard, through the doors, into the ears of anyone listening outside. If Judas was there, if he heard this, what did he feel? Did his stomach drop? Did his hands begin to shake? Did the 30 pieces of silver suddenly feel impossibly heavy in his purse? The gospel accounts tell us that after the verdict, the guards began to mock Jesus. They spit in his face. They struck him with their fists. They blindfolded him and hit him, saying, "Prophesy to us, Messiah, who hit you?" The night wore on with Jesus enduring humiliation and physical abuse at the hands of the very people who were supposed to serve God. As dawn broke over Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin reconvened for a formal morning session, making their nighttime proceedings official. But they had a problem. Under Roman occupation, the Jewish authorities did not have the power to execute anyone. They could make religious judgments, impose lesser punishments, but capital punishment required Roman approval. They needed Pontius Pilate, the governor, to carry out the sentence. So they bound Jesus again and led him through the early morning streets to the Praetorium, Pilate's headquarters when he was in Jerusalem. It was now Friday morning, the day before the Sabbath, the day of preparation for the Passover. The city was waking up. People were beginning their day, shopping for final supplies for the Sabbath meals, preparing for the festivities. And through these ordinary streets walked an extraordinary procession. The bound prisoner who claimed to be the Son of God, surrounded by the religious elite who wanted him dead. Did Judas follow? We can only assume he did, drawn by some horrible compulsion to see what his betrayal had wrought. He would have seen them bring Jesus before Pilate, would have watched as the religious leaders who would not enter a Gentile's dwelling, maintaining their ritual purity for Passover, stood outside shouting their accusations. Pilate came out to them. "What charges are you bringing against this man?" he asked. They needed a charge that would matter to Rome. Blasphemy meant nothing to Roman law. So they reframed their accusation in political terms. "We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king." It was brilliant in its cynicism. Jesus had actually said to give to Caesar what was Caesar's. He had never organized political opposition or called for tax resistance. But Pilate didn't know this, and the accusation was crafted to force his hand. Any claim to kingship was treason against Rome. Any competing authority was rebellion. Pilate questioned Jesus privately. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus' answer was enigmatic, deep, speaking of kingdoms not of this world. Pilate seemed genuinely puzzled by him. He could find no basis for a charge. He tried to release him. When he learned Jesus was from Galilee, he sent him to Herod Antipas, who happened to be in Jerusalem for the Passover. Perhaps this was an attempt to pass off a difficult decision, or perhaps it was a political courtesy, allowing Herod to judge one of his own subjects. But Herod, after questioning Jesus and getting no response, only mocking him and sending him back dressed in an elegant robe, returned him to Pilate. The decision came back to the governor. Through all of this, where was Judas? Standing in the crowd, perhaps, watching the prisoner being shuffled from one authority to another. Seeing Jesus, exhausted from a sleepless night of interrogation and abuse, standing with quiet dignity before his accusers. Watching and realizing with growing horror that this was not going to end well. Pilate tried again to release him. He offered the crowd a choice, as was the custom at Passover. He would release one prisoner, and they could choose between Jesus and Barabbas, a known insurrectionist and murderer. Surely Pilate thought they would choose to release this harmless teacher over a dangerous criminal. But the chief priests and elders worked the crowd. They persuaded them to ask for Barabbas. When Pilate asked what he should do with Jesus, the crowd began to shout, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Crucifixion. The word itself was obscene in polite Roman society, too horrible even to speak of. It was the punishment reserved for slaves, for rebels, for the worst criminals. A death so brutal, so prolonged, so designed to maximize suffering and humiliation that it served as a deterrent to anyone who might challenge Roman power. The victim was stripped naked, beaten, and then nailed or tied to a wooden cross to hang, until they slowly suffocated, sometimes over days, exposed to the elements and the mockery of passers-by. This was what the crowd was demanding for Jesus. And Judas, standing somewhere in that crowd or on its edges, heard the chant growing louder. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Whatever Judas had expected, whatever he had hoped for, whatever justifications he had constructed in his mind, they were crumbling now. Perhaps he had thought Jesus would be questioned and released. Perhaps he had believed Jesus would reveal his power and escape. Perhaps he had convinced himself he was forcing Jesus' hand, compelling him to finally establish his kingdom. But none of that was happening. Instead, he was watching a good man, a man he had walked with for 3 years, a man who had trusted him, being sentenced to the most brutal death the Roman Empire could devise. And it was his fault. His kiss had led to this. His betrayal had put Jesus in chains. His 30 pieces of silver, now burning like coals in his purse, was the price of this innocent blood. Matthew's Gospel tells us what happened next, and it's here that we see the full weight of Judas's realization crushing down upon him. But that moment of ultimate despair deserves its own examination, its own careful attention. For now we leave Judas standing in the crowd, watching as Pilate, washing his hands in a basin of water in a futile attempt to absolve himself of responsibility, gives the order. Jesus of Nazareth would be scourged and crucified. The sentence was passed. The execution would proceed, and nothing Judas could do now would stop it. The moment of realization can arrive like a physical blow, stealing breath and buckling knees. For Judas Iscariot, that moment came as he stood in the crowd watching the proceedings unfold before Pilate's judgment seat, hearing the crowd's bloodthirsty chant, seeing the calm acceptance on Jesus' bruised and exhausted face. The full weight of what he had done crashed down upon him with devastating force. Matthew's Gospel gives us the starkest account. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse. The Greek word used here is powerful, suggesting not mere regret but a profound change of mind, a complete reversal of judgment. Whatever Judas had told himself to justify the betrayal, whatever rationalizations he had constructed, whatever hopes he had harbored, all of it shattered in that moment. Jesus was condemned to crucifixion, and Judas had delivered him to this fate. Perhaps until that moment, some part of Judas had believed it wouldn't come to this. Perhaps he had convinced himself that Jesus would escape, would reveal his power, would somehow turn the tables on his accusers. Or perhaps Judas had simply not allowed himself to think through the consequences, had not let his mind follow the path to its logical conclusion. But now there was no escaping reality. The sentence had been passed. The execution would proceed. And an innocent man would die in agony because Judas had betrayed him. The word innocent is crucial. Judas didn't merely realize he had made a mistake or a poor calculation, he realized he had betrayed innocent blood. Jesus was not guilty of the charges against him. He was not a political revolutionary plotting against Rome. He was not a blasphemer deserving death. He was innocent, and Judas knew it. He had walked with Jesus for 3 years. He had witnessed his compassion, his integrity, his love for the broken and lost. Whatever else Judas had come to believe or doubt, he could not deny Jesus' innocence, and that innocence made the betrayal infinitely worse. Judas had not merely turned against a failed Messiah or a disappointing leader. He had delivered a righteous man to death. He had traded innocent blood for 30 pieces of silver. The money. Suddenly the coins in his purse felt like molten metal, burning through the leather, searing his flesh. How had he ever thought this was worth it? What had he been thinking? 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave, the insulting sum that Zechariah the prophet had been paid as God's wages. And for this pittance, Judas had betrayed the man who might truly have been the Son of God. The remorse that seized Judas was not the healthy repentance that leads to restoration. The Greek word used suggests a regret focused on consequences rather than on the wrong itself, a remorse that drives toward despair rather than toward grace. It was the crushing recognition of having done something irreversible, something that could never be undone, never be made right. The betrayal could not be taken back. The kiss in the garden could not be unkissed. The arrest could not be prevented. The condemnation could not be reversed. But perhaps, Judas thought, he could at least undo part of it. He could return the money. He could confess what he had done. He could declare Jesus' innocence. Maybe that would help. Maybe that would count for something. Maybe that would ease the terrible weight pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe, making him want to tear his own skin off in anguish. He left the crowd around Pilate's headquarters and made his way through the early morning streets to the temple. The chief priests and elders would be there, perhaps celebrating their victory, perhaps making preparations for the Passover sacrifice that evening. The very men who had paid him to betray Jesus, who had received his information with such delight, who had promised him 30 pieces of silver for delivering Jesus into their hands. Judas found them in the temple courts. Matthew doesn't give us details about exactly where or when, but the encounter happened. And what follows is one of the most chilling exchanges in all of Scripture. "I have sinned," Judas said to them, his voice perhaps breaking with emotion, "for I have betrayed innocent blood." It was a confession, an admission of guilt, a declaration of Jesus' innocence, and more than that, it was an implicit plea for help, for understanding, for some way to make this right. Judas had done what they wanted, and now he was trapped in the horror of it, drowning in regret, and he brought his confession to the very men who had employed him. Their response was cold, dismissive, cruel in its indifference. "What is that to us? That's your responsibility." The callousness of this reply is breathtaking. These were religious leaders, men who supposedly cared about the Torah, about justice, about the moral and spiritual well-being of God's people. Yet when a man came to them in obvious anguish, confessing sin and declaring the innocence of the man they had just condemned, their response was essentially, "Not our problem." They had gotten what they wanted. Jesus was condemned. Their rival was about to be eliminated. The troublesome teacher who had challenged their authority would soon be dead. Why should they care that their informant was having second thoughts? Why should they concern themselves with his guilty conscience? What is that to us? The words reveal everything about who these men were. They had no interest in truth or justice. They had manipulated the legal system to destroy someone they saw as a threat. They had paid for betrayal and they had received it. The transaction was complete. What happened to Judas now was irrelevant to them. That's your responsibility. In Greek, the phrase carries a sense of dismissal, almost contempt. You deal with it. It's your problem. We're done with you. Can you imagine the desolation Judas felt in that moment? He had just confessed his sin to religious authorities, men who were supposed to represent God's justice and mercy. He had declared Jesus' innocence, hoping perhaps that they would call off the execution, that his testimony would matter. But they didn't care. They wouldn't help. They had used him and now they were discarding him. What Judas did next was an act of impotent rage and desperate symbolism. He threw the 30 pieces of silver into the temple, hurling the coins across the sacred space. The money clattered and scattered across the stone floor, the sound echoing in the courts where thousands of Passover lambs would soon be slaughtered. Then Judas turned and left, walking away from the temple, away from the priests who had rejected his confession, away from any possibility of redemption. The chief priests picked up the coins, and here we see their hypocrisy in stark relief. These men who had just bribed someone to betray an innocent man, who had conducted an illegal trial in the middle of the night, who had manipulated crowds and pressured Pilate into ordering a crucifixion, suddenly became scrupulous about religious law. "It is against the law to put this into the treasury," they said, "since it is blood money." Blood money. They acknowledged what it was. They knew these coins had purchased a man's death. Yet this knowledge didn't trouble them about what they had done to Jesus. It only troubled them about where to put the coins. They couldn't put blood money into the temple treasury because that would defile it according to their interpretation of the law. The irony is sickening. They had no problem spilling innocent blood, but they were careful about where they put the payment for it. They consulted together and decided to use the money to buy a potter's field, a plot of ground that could serve as a burial place for foreigners who died in Jerusalem. The field became known as the Field of Blood Akeldama in Aramaic, a name that would endure for centuries. And in this transaction they unknowingly fulfilled another prophecy from Zechariah. They took the 30 pieces of silver, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used them to buy the potter's field as the Lord commanded me. Even in their rejection of Judas, even in their disposal of the blood money, they were playing out a script written centuries before by the prophets they claimed to serve. But they didn't see it. They were too busy maintaining their ritual purity while condemning an innocent man to death. Meanwhile, Judas walked through Jerusalem in a state of profound despair. The confession had brought no relief. The return of the money had changed nothing. Jesus was still condemned, the crucifixion would still happen, and the religious authorities didn't care. They had told him plainly that his guilt was his own problem. Where did Judas go? What thoughts tormented him as he walked through streets that had become suddenly unfamiliar, hostile, closing in around him? Did he think about the 3 years he had spent with Jesus? Did he remember specific moments, specific teachings? Did Jesus' words about forgiveness echo in his mind, only to be drowned out by the voice of despair telling him that some sins are too great to be forgiven? Did he consider going to the other disciples? But how could he face them? They would be scattered, confused, terrified by Jesus' arrest. And he was the one who had betrayed their master, their friend. Peter had denied Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed, but Peter's denial was born of fear for his own life. Judas's betrayal was something else entirely. Premeditated, calculated, purchased with silver. The weight of guilt can be crushing, literally physically crushing, bearing down on a person until they can't stand under it anymore. Psychologists call it moral injury, the wound that comes from violating your own deepest values, from doing something that fundamentally contradicts who you believe yourself to be. Soldiers who kill non-combatants sometimes experience it. Doctors who make fatal errors sometimes experience it. And Judas, who had betrayed the man he had followed for 3 years, who had delivered innocence to death for the price of a slave, was drowning in it. The gospel accounts tell us that Judas left the temple and went away from the priests who rejected his confession, away from the crowd baying for Jesus' blood, away from the possibility of forgiveness or redemption. He went away to a place where he could be alone with his guilt, his regret, his unbearable knowledge of what he had done. And there, in that lonely place, Judas made a final, irreversible choice. The man who had betrayed life chose death. But the manner of that death and what it means requires careful examination. For in Judas's final act, we see both the tragedy of despair and the terrible truth that some people, when confronted with their own evil, cannot bear to continue living. The final chapter of Judas Iscariot's earthly story is written in blood and darkness, but even here at the very end, we encounter mystery and disagreement. The manner of Judas's death is recorded in 2 different places in the New Testament, and these accounts at first glance seem contradictory. Yet both agree on the essential horror. The man who betrayed Jesus could not live with what he had done. Matthew's Gospel gives us the more detailed narrative of Judas's end. After throwing the silver coins into the temple and being rejected by the chief priests, Judas went away and hanged himself. The Greek word used is precise and unambiguous. He strangled himself by hanging. Matthew provides no additional details about the location or the method, only this stark statement of fact. The man who had kissed Jesus in betrayal, whose name would become forever synonymous with treachery, took his own life. Suicide in the ancient Jewish world was rare and viewed with profound sadness and theological complexity. Life was understood as a gift from God, and to take one's own life was to reject that gift, to declare that the pain of living exceeded one's faith in God's mercy or power to redeem. There were only a handful of suicides recorded in the Hebrew Scriptures. King Saul falling on his sword after being wounded in battle, his armor-bearer doing the same, Ahithophel hanging himself after his counsel was rejected, and Zimri burning down his palace with himself inside. Each was seen as a tragic end, often connected to some profound failure or loss of hope. Judas joined this grim company. The tradition that developed in later centuries placed his death somewhere in the Hinnom Valley, south of Jerusalem, a place already associated with death and defilement. This was the valley where, in ancient times, some apostate Israelites had sacrificed their children to the god Moloch, burning them in fire. The prophet Jeremiah had declared it would be called the Valley of Slaughter. It had become Jerusalem's garbage dump, where refuse was burned continuously, the fires never going out, the worms never dying. Jesus himself used this valley, Gehenna in Greek, as an image of hell, the place of final judgment and separation from God. If tradition is correct and Judas hanged himself in or near this valley, the symbolism is almost too heavy to bear. The place of ancient apostasy and child sacrifice, the valley that represented hell itself, became the site where the betrayer of the Son of God ended his own life. From Gethsemane, the place of crushing and pressing, to Gehenna, the place of burning and judgment. Judas's final journey traced a descent into the darkest places, both literal and spiritual. But there is another account of Judas's death, and it comes from the book of Acts, written by Luke as a sequel to his gospel. In the first chapter, as the disciples are gathering after Jesus' ascension, Peter addresses the group about the need to replace Judas. In explaining what happened to Judas, Peter says, "With the payment he received for his wickedness, Judas bought a field. There he fell headlong, his body burst open, and all his intestines spilled out. Everyone in Jerusalem heard about this, so they called that field in their language a Keldama, that is, field of blood." This account seems on the surface to contradict Matthew's. Here, Judas doesn't hang himself but falls headlong, his body splitting open in a gruesome death. Moreover, Acts suggests that Judas himself bought the field with the betrayal money, whereas Matthew clearly states that the chief priests bought the field after Judas threw the money back at them. How do we reconcile these accounts? Scholars and theologians have debated this for centuries. Some suggest that both are true, that Judas hanged himself and the rope or branch broke, causing his body to fall and burst open on the rocks below. Ancient Christian traditions sometimes combined the accounts in this way. The 2nd century writer Papias, whose works survive only in fragments quoted by later authors, described an even more grotesque version where Judas's body swelled up before bursting. Others point out that the difference might be one of perspective and emphasis rather than contradiction. Matthew, writing primarily for a Jewish audience, focused on Judas's act of hanging and the religious authorities' use of the blood money, drawing connections to Old Testament prophecy. Luke, writing Acts for a more Gentile audience and focusing on the apostolic mission, emphasized the field that became associated with Judas and its name in the local language. The detail about who bought the field can be understood as two ways of describing the same transaction. Technically, the chief priests bought it with Judas's money, but since it was his money, it could be said that he bought it, in the sense that his betrayal payment purchased it. Legal and cultural conventions of that time sometimes attributed purchases to the person whose money was used even if they didn't personally make the transaction. But perhaps we're too focused on harmonizing the accounts. Perhaps what matters is not the exact physical details, but the theological meaning both accounts convey. Both agree that Judas died violently, tragically, in connection with a field that became known as the Field of Blood. Both agree that his death was a consequence of his betrayal. Both agree that the money meant to reward treachery instead purchased a plot of cursed ground. The Field of Blood, Akeldama, became a lasting memorial to Judas's betrayal. To this day, there is a traditional site in Jerusalem identified as Akeldama, located at the junction of the Hinnom and Kidron valleys. Archaeological evidence shows it was used as a burial ground for pilgrims and foreigners, just as the Gospel accounts describe. The name endured for 2,000 years, a permanent reminder of what happened when one of the 12 betrayed the Son of God. Matthew saw in these events the fulfillment of prophecy, though his citation is complex and draws from multiple Old Testament sources. He writes, "Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took the 30 pieces of silver, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used them to buy the potter's field, as the Lord commanded me." The quotation actually appears to come primarily from Zechariah 11, verses 12 and 13, where God tells the prophet to ask for his wages from the people of Israel, and they pay him 30 pieces of silver, which God calls the handsome price at which they valued me. God then tells Zechariah to throw the silver to the potter in the house of the Lord. But Matthew attributes it to Jeremiah, perhaps because Jeremiah 19 speaks of the potter and the valley of Ben Hinnom being renamed the Valley of Slaughter because of blood guilt. Whether Matthew was combining prophecies or working from a different textual tradition we no longer have access to, his point is clear. What happened with Judas, the 30 pieces of silver, and the field bought with blood money was not random chance. It was part of a pattern woven through the prophetic scriptures, a pattern of Israel rejecting God's messengers, of God's servants being valued cheaply, of blood guilt requiring acknowledgement. The field itself became a powerful symbol in Christian tradition. It represented wasted potential, money gained through sin, ground cursed by blood guilt. Unlike the upper room, which became a sacred site commemorating the Last Supper, or Golgotha, which became venerated as the place of crucifixion and resurrection, Akeldama remained a place of death and burial, associated with Judas's end rather than Jesus's triumph. Some early Christian writers saw in Judas's death a form of divine judgment. Papias, as mentioned, described it in grotesque terms that emphasized physical corruption and decay, as if Judas's outer body manifested the inner corruption of his soul. Others saw it as the inevitable consequence of despair, the final fruit of betrayal. When someone rejects God's mercy and chooses isolation over repentance, when guilt becomes not a road to redemption but a prison of self-condemnation, death becomes an escape from a life that has become unbearable. But here we must pause and consider something uncomfortable. Judas died while Jesus was still alive. The crucifixion hadn't happened yet when Judas hanged himself. Jesus was being scourged, mocked, prepared for execution, but he hadn't yet been nailed to the cross. He hadn't yet spoken the words, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." He hadn't yet told the thief beside him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." He hadn't yet cried out, "It is finished," and given up his spirit. What if Judas had waited? What if he had gone to Golgotha and watched the crucifixion? What if he had been there when Jesus forgave his executioners? What if he had heard Jesus promise paradise to a criminal? Would he have understood that even his betrayal could be forgiven? That even he could be redeemed? Peter denied Jesus 3 times, cursing and swearing that he didn't know him. Peter's betrayal was also real, also painful. Yet Peter, overcome with remorse when he heard the rooster crow and remembered Jesus' prediction, went out and wept bitterly. And after the resurrection, Jesus restored Peter, asking him 3 times, "Do you love me?" giving him 3 chances to affirm his love, undoing the 3 denials. Peter went on to become a pillar of the early church, eventually dying as a martyr, crucified upside down according to tradition because he didn't feel worthy to die in the same manner as his Lord. But Judas couldn't wait, couldn't hope, couldn't imagine that forgiveness might extend even to him. His remorse led not to repentance but to despair, not to restoration but to destruction. He went away, Matthew says, away from the possibility of mercy, away from the community that might have held him, away from the cross where redemption was being purchased even for betrayers, and in a field outside Jerusalem, a field that would be known forever after as the field of blood. Judas Iscariot died alone, the 30 pieces of silver returned but the guilt remaining, the betrayal complete but the story not yet understanding that it could have had a different ending. The field remains to this day, a testimony written in earth and stone. But what it testifies to depends on who is reading. Does it speak only of judgment and despair? Or does it also whisper tragically of a mercy that was available but not received, a forgiveness that was offered but not accepted, a redemption that was possible but not believed in? The field where Judas died became a landmark, but the memory of what he did became something far more powerful, a symbol, an archetype, a name that would echo through 2 millennia of human culture. From the moment the early Christians began telling the story of Jesus, Judas was there as the dark counterpoint, the betrayer, the one who proved that even proximity to divinity doesn't guarantee salvation. And as the centuries rolled forward, each generation would reimagine Judas, projecting onto him their own understanding of evil, free will, and damnation. The earliest Christian writers grappled with Judas in their attempts to understand the paradox he represented. How could one of the 12, chosen by Jesus himself, fall so completely? The Church Fathers, those theologians of the first few centuries who shaped Christian doctrine, generally portrayed Judas as a cautionary tale about the dangers of avarice and the possibility of apostasy. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing in the late 2nd century, saw Judas as someone who had never truly believed, whose heart had never been transformed despite walking with Jesus. Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century wrestled with the question of whether Judas's betrayal was predestined or chosen freely, ultimately arguing that Judas had free will but made catastrophically wrong choices. Augustine of Hippo, perhaps the most influential of the early church fathers, used Judas to explore his theology of predestination, suggesting that God knew from eternity who would be saved and who would be lost, and Judas belonged to the latter category. But it was John Chrysostom, the golden-mouthed preacher of the 4th century, who captured what many felt about Judas. He was not a monster, but a man who loved money more than truth, who let greed harden his heart until he was capable of the unthinkable. Chrysostom's sermons emphasized that Judas didn't start out as a villain. He was corrupted gradually, through small compromises, through the love of money that Scripture calls the root of all evil. As Christianity spread and became the dominant religion of Europe, Judas's image appeared in art, literature, and drama. Medieval mystery plays, those religious dramas performed in town squares and churches, often featured Judas as a character. Sometimes he was portrayed as purely evil, a devil in human form. Other times, particularly in later medieval works, he was given moments of doubt, of anguish, allowing audiences to see his humanity even as they condemned his choice. In visual art, Judas became instantly recognizable through certain conventions. He was often painted with red or yellow hair, colors associated with deceit in medieval symbolism. He frequently appeared without a halo when the other disciples had them. In depictions of the Last Supper, he was positioned apart from the others, or shown clutching the money bag, his symbol. Sometimes he was depicted with a demon whispering in his ear or even sitting on his shoulder. One of the most famous artistic representations comes from Giotto di Bondone's frescoes in the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua, painted in the early 14th century. His depiction of the kiss in Gethsemane shows Judas embracing Jesus while Jesus looks at him with an expression of profound sadness and knowledge. Judas's yellow robe wraps around Jesus like a snake, and his face, though not monstrous, is closed off, determined, while Jesus' face remains open and sorrowful. It captures something essential about the betrayal, not a battle between obvious good and obvious evil, but a tragedy of hardened hearts and rejected love. But the most influential literary portrayal of Judas in Western culture came from Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, written in the early 14th century. In Dante's vision of hell, the inferno, the geography of damnation is carefully organized. The deeper you go, the worse the sin. At the very bottom, frozen in ice at the center of hell, is Satan himself, a massive three-headed demon trapped in the frozen lake of Cocytus. And in each of Satan's three mouths, being eternally chewed, are three sinners who represent the ultimate betrayals. Brutus and Cassius, who betrayed Julius Caesar, and in the central mouth suffering the worst torment, Judas Iscariot. For Dante, betrayal of one's benefactor was the worst possible sin. Worse than murder, worse than heresy, worse than any form of violence or fraud. And Judas, who betrayed the Son of God himself, deserved the absolute lowest place in the entire cosmos, eternally gnawed by Satan's teeth, his back flayed open. It's an image of such complete and final damnation that it shaped Western imagination for centuries. Judas was not just a sinner. He was the ultimate sinner, occupying the worst place imaginable in the entire moral universe. Yet even as this image of Judas as the arch-traitor solidified in Western Christianity, there were always questions, always alternative voices asking uncomfortable questions. If Jesus had to die for humanity's salvation, and if someone had to betray him for that to happen, was Judas damned for fulfilling a necessary role in God's plan? Was he a villain or a victim? Did he have a choice, or was he predestined to be the betrayer? These questions intensified during the Enlightenment and into the modern period as Western culture began to question traditional religious narratives. Some writers began to reimagine Judas not as evil but as misunderstood, perhaps even tragic. What if his motives were not greed but misguided zeal? What if he genuinely believed he was helping bring about the kingdom of God? The 20th century saw an explosion of alternative interpretations. Nikos Kazantzakis' novel The Last Temptation of Christ, published in 1951, portrayed Judas as Jesus' most loyal disciple, the only one strong enough to do what Jesus secretly asked him to do: betray him so that crucifixion and redemption could occur. This interpretation was controversial, even blasphemous to many, but it represented a growing willingness to see Judas as something more complex than pure villain. The rock opera Jesus Christ Superstar, which premiered in 1970, gave Judas a voice, literally, allowing him to sing about his doubts, his concerns about Jesus' movement, his confusion about what Jesus wants. In this telling, Judas is not evil but frustrated, genuinely concerned that Jesus is becoming too messianic, too divine, losing sight of the social justice message Judas believes is more important. It's a very modern psychological interpretation that makes Judas sympathetic, even if still wrong. Then in 1978, an ancient manuscript surfaced that would add yet another dimension to the Judas story. Actually, it had been discovered earlier, probably in the 1970s near El Minya in Egypt, but it took years before scholars could examine it. It was a Coptic manuscript from the 3rd or 4th century, a translation of an earlier Greek text that dated back to the 2nd century. Its title, The Gospel of Judas. This text, part of a collection of writings associated with Gnosticism, an early Christian movement that the Orthodox Church rejected as heretical, told a radically different story. In this gospel, Judas is not the villain but the hero. He alone among the disciples truly understands who Jesus is and what he's come to do. Jesus specifically asks Judas to betray him, telling him, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." In this interpretation, the physical body is a prison for the divine spirit, and Judas, by enabling Jesus' death, is actually helping free the divine Christ from material existence. The Gospel of Judas created a sensation when it was published and made accessible to scholars in the early 2000s. Here was an ancient text that completely inverted the traditional story, making Judas the most enlightened disciple rather than the worst traitor. But scholars were quick to point out that this gospel was not part of the original Christian tradition. It represented a Gnostic interpretation from a later period, reflecting Gnostic theology that saw the material world as evil and the goal of salvation as escape from physical existence. The canonical Gospels, written much earlier and closer to the actual events, told a different story. Still, the Gospel of Judas reminded the modern world of something important. People have always struggled to understand Judas. From the very earliest centuries of Christianity, there were alternative interpretations, alternative ways of making sense of his betrayal and his role in the salvation story. In contemporary culture, Judas continues to fascinate. He appears in novels, films, plays, theological treatises. Some portray him as mentally ill, suffering from depression or delusions that led to his terrible choice. Others see him as a political revolutionary disappointed when Jesus refused to be a military messiah. Still others view him through the lens of divine determinism, a man who never had a real choice because the script was written before time began. Jewish scholars have also contributed to the discussion, sometimes seeing the Christian portrayal of Judas as containing anti-Semitic elements, particularly in medieval depictions that emphasize Jewish stereotypes. The name Judas, after all, is the same as Judah, connecting the betrayer to Jewish identity in ways that have sometimes been used to justify prejudice against Jewish people. This adds another layer of tragedy to Judas's story. His name has been used to hurt the very people Jesus himself belonged to. What is striking about 2,000 years of interpretation is that no consensus has emerged. Judas remains a mystery, a puzzle, a question without a simple answer. Each generation finds in him a mirror for its own anxieties about free will, about the nature of evil, about whether some sins are unforgivable, about whether despair is ever justified. Is he in hell, as Dante imagined? Did he find mercy at the last moment? Could God's grace extend even to the betrayer of the Son of God? The Gospels don't answer these questions. They tell us what Judas did and how he died, but they don't tell us his final destiny. That silence has allowed 2,000 years of speculation, interpretation, and reimagining. Beyond the historical facts and cultural interpretations lies the deepest mystery of all, the theological puzzle that Judas represents. His story forces us to confront questions that have divided Christians for 2 millennia, questions that touch the very nature of God, human freedom, and divine sovereignty. Was Judas predestined to betray Jesus, or did he freely choose to do so? And if he was necessary for salvation to occur, can we truly call him evil? The problem begins with prophecy. The Old Testament contains passages that seem to predict aspects of Jesus' betrayal. Psalm 41 says, "Even my close friend, someone I trusted, one who shared my bread, has turned against me." Zechariah 11 speaks of 30 pieces of silver in the potter's field. If these prophecies had to be fulfilled, if Scripture demanded that the Messiah be betrayed for a specific price by someone close to him, then didn't someone have to play that role? And if Judas was chosen for this role before the foundation of the world, how can we hold him morally responsible? Jesus himself seemed to acknowledge this tension. At the Last Supper, he said, "The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. But woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." Here we see both divine necessity and human culpability. Yes, betrayal must happen according to Scripture. But woe to the one who does it. The betrayer is not excused by the fact that his action fulfills prophecy. Different Christian traditions have wrestled with this paradox in different ways. The Reformed tradition, following John Calvin, emphasizes divine sovereignty and predestination. In this view, God ordained everything from eternity, including Judas's betrayal. God knew exactly what Judas would do and incorporated that action into his plan of salvation. Yet Judas was still morally responsible because he acted according to his own evil desires. God didn't force him to betray Jesus. God simply ordained that someone with Judas's character would be in that position to make that choice. It's a difficult concept, requiring a distinction between God's foreknowledge and God's causation. The Arminian tradition, following Jacob Arminius, emphasizes human free will and God's foreknowledge without predetermination. In this view, God knew what Judas would freely choose, but Judas genuinely had the power to choose differently. The prophecies about betrayal were God's prediction based on perfect knowledge of what would happen, not a script that had to be followed. Judas could have chosen to remain faithful, and if he had, God would have accomplished salvation through different means, or someone else would have taken the role of betrayer. Catholic theology has generally maintained a middle position, emphasizing that God's grace is offered to everyone, including Judas, but humans can freely reject that grace. Judas received the same opportunities for conversion and repentance as the other disciples, but he hardened his heart against grace. The Church has never officially declared anyone to be in hell, not even Judas, because that final judgment belongs to God alone. There's theological room, however slight, for the possibility that even Judas might have experienced God's mercy at the last moment, though most Catholic theologians through history have assumed his damnation. Eastern Orthodox theology approaches the question somewhat differently, less concerned with legal categories of guilt and punishment, and more focused on Judas's separation from God through his own choice. Judas experienced the same love of Christ as the other disciples, but he closed himself off from it. His despair was the ultimate rejection of God's mercy. The Orthodox Church doesn't spend much time debating whether Judas was predestined. Instead, it sees him as a warning about the danger of allowing bitterness, greed, and despair to separate us from divine love. Jewish perspectives on Judas are particularly interesting because they're looking at the story from outside Christian theological frameworks. Some Jewish scholars see Judas as a tragic figure caught in circumstances beyond his control, possibly even as a scapegoat in a story written by Christians trying to make sense of their leader's execution. Others point out that the emphasis on Judas's villainy served Christian needs to explain why most Jews didn't accept Jesus as the Messiah. If even one of Jesus's chosen disciples betrayed him, it's easier to understand why the Jewish people as a whole might have rejected him. The question of whether Jesus could have been crucified without Judas is especially provocative. Jesus had made plenty of enemies among the religious authorities. They had been looking for ways to arrest him for some time. Would they eventually have found an opportunity even without inside information? Almost certainly. But Judas's betrayal allowed it to happen at a specific time, during Passover, when Jesus could be portrayed as the Passover lamb sacrificed for the sins of the world. The timing was theologically significant, not just historically convenient. Perhaps the deepest question is this: can God bring good out of evil without being responsible for the evil? Christianity answers yes. The crucifixion was the worst crime in human history, the murder of God incarnate. Yet through it, God accomplished the salvation of humanity. Judas's betrayal was genuinely evil, genuinely wrong, genuinely culpable, yet it was also woven into God's plan of redemption. Both truths must be held together, however uncomfortable that tension might be. The theological debates will continue as long as humans ponder divine mysteries. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Judas's story is not what it tells us about God's sovereignty or human free will. It's what it reveals about ourselves. The uncomfortable truth that keeps us returning to this ancient tragedy is the nagging question: could any of us be Judas? We want to believe that betrayal at that scale requires a special kind of evil, a darkness of soul that ordinary people don't possess. We want Judas to be a monster, fundamentally different from us, so we can safely distance ourselves from his choices. But the gospel accounts don't give us that comfort. They present Judas as one of the 12 chosen by Jesus, trusted with responsibility, walking the same roads and eating the same meals as Peter, John, and the others. If anything, his ordinariness is what makes him so terrifying. Judas teaches us that proximity to holiness doesn't automatically transform us. He witnessed miracles, heard profound teachings, saw the compassion of Christ up close, yet somehow his heart remained unconverted at the deepest level. How many people sit in churches every week hearing the same gospel message yet remain unchanged? How many of us are close to truth without being transformed by it? His story reveals how betrayal often begins small. The Gospel of John suggests Judas was helping himself to the money bag before the final betrayal. If true, it shows how small compromises prepare the ground for larger ones. We justify little acts of dishonesty, tiny betrayals of trust, minor deceptions, telling ourselves they don't really matter. But each small compromise makes the next one easier, until we find ourselves capable of things we once thought unimaginable. Judas also teaches us about the danger of disappointed expectations. If he joined Jesus' movement expecting a political messiah who would overthrow Rome, every day with Jesus must have been a growing frustration. Jesus kept talking about love and forgiveness instead of revolution. He associated with tax collectors instead of zealots. He spoke of his kingdom not being of this world. Sometimes our bitterness toward God comes not from God's failure, but from our own mistaken expectations about what God should do or be. The 30 pieces of silver remind us that we often betray what matters most for astonishingly little. Not just money, though that's part of it. We betray relationships for momentary pleasure. We betray principles for temporary advantage. We betray our better selves for immediate gratification. The price is always too low, and the realization comes too late. Perhaps most tragically, Judas teaches us about the difference between remorse and repentance. He was seized with remorse. He recognized his sin. He confessed to the chief priests. He tried to return the money. But remorse that leads to despair rather than to grace is ultimately destructive. Judas couldn't imagine forgiveness extending to him. He couldn't believe that even his betrayal might be covered by the mercy he had heard Jesus preach about. So he went away and hanged himself while Jesus was still alive, still able to forgive, still offering redemption even from the cross. This is perhaps the saddest what-if in all of Scripture. What if Judas had waited? What if he had gone to Golgotha and heard Jesus say, "Father, forgive them"? What if he had been there when Jesus promised paradise to the repentant thief dying beside him? Would Judas have understood then that no sin is beyond forgiveness, no betrayer beyond redemption? Peter denied Jesus 3 times, cursing and swearing he didn't know him. The betrayal was real, the sin genuine. But Peter wept and waited, and Jesus restored him. Thomas doubted the resurrection. Jesus appeared to him specifically, inviting him to touch his wounds. The disciples all fled when Jesus was arrested, yet Jesus forgave them all, welcomed them back, sent them out to change the world. But Judas removed himself from the possibility of restoration. His despair was the final betrayal, the ultimate rejection of Jesus' message about grace. And this teaches us something crucial: that the unforgivable sin might not be any particular action, no matter how terrible, but the refusal to believe in forgiveness. The closing of the heart to mercy. The decision that we are beyond redemption, yet even here we must be careful. We don't know Judas's final thoughts. We don't know if in his last moment he cried out to God. We don't know what mercy might have met him beyond the veil of death. The Church has presumed his damnation for 2,000 years, but presumption is not certainty. Only God knows the human heart fully. Only God judges finally. Judas's story remains a mystery wrapped in tragedy, a warning and a question mark. It warns us about the capacity for evil that exists in every human heart, about how close we all are to betrayal, about how easily we can rationalize terrible choices. But it also questions us. What would we have done in his place? How certain are we that our disappointments, our doubts, our temptations wouldn't have led us down the same path? In the end, perhaps the story of Judas Iscariot is less about understanding one ancient man's choices and more about examining our own hearts. It's about recognizing our capacity for both betrayal and redemption. It's about choosing moment by moment which path we'll walk. And it's about learning to believe in a grace that's larger than our worst failures, a mercy that's deeper than our darkest sins, and a love that pursues us even when we're running away into the night. The kiss in the garden happened 2,000 years ago. But somewhere, in some way, it happens still whenever we betray what we know is true for what seems temporarily advantageous. And the question remains, echoing across the centuries: will we, like Judas, let despair have the final word? Or will we dare to believe in a redemption bigger than our betrayals,